Okay, everyone, welcome to a Breaking the Spell guest interview. Tonight we have Angsu, Santosh, and in the early morning in America, we have Bryan Van Norden, our special guest for today's show. So, Bryan, first thing I'm going to do is just introduce you formally first, so let our viewers know who you are. So, Bryan, I actually realized your website still lists your Singapore address, but anyway, you are the James Monroe Taylor Chair in Philosophy at Vassar College and chair professor in philosophy in the School of Philosophy in Wuhan University. You have published 10 books on Chinese and comparative philosophy, including Introduction to Classical Chinese Philosophy, Readings in Later Chinese Philosophy, Readings in Classical Chinese Philosophy, Taking Back Philosophy, a Multicultural Manifesto, something that I read over the weekend, and more recently, Classical Chinese for Everyone, a guide for absolute beginners. You also have a TED video on Confucius that you have, there's 500,000 views. And for our viewers also to know, you have a number of essays as a public intellectual. So that includes Confucius on gay marriage, If Philosophy Won't Diversify, Let's Call It for What It Really Is, which you co-authored with J. Garfield. The Ignorant Do Not Have a Right to an Audience, which we will be talking about tonight. Was this ancient Taoist the first philosopher of disability, which you co-authored with John Edmund? And for our viewers to know, many of your works have been translated into many languages. You've been honored as one of the best 200 professors in the US by the Princeton Review, and you were in Singapore from 2017 to 2020 as the Kwan Ing Tong Hu Cho Temple Professor at Yale NUS College. Bryan, is obviously very, very important and interesting, but really for me, what's more interesting for me is that you play, I guess, amateur professional poker. You play in the World Series in Las Vegas. And you're very candid and open that you play video games. So I won't let you go tonight without asking you at least one question about that, about our common interests. And you know, I also was very impressed with your extensive and detailed documentation of your family history. And as Angsu mentioned just before we came on air, you speak way better Mandarin than the both of us. So that puts us all to shame. So let me start with something light and personal. So obviously for tonight, we're going to talk a lot about philosophy. And I want our viewers to know what got you interested in philosophy, specifically Chinese philosophy, and your pathway into academia as well.
Well, yes, again, thank you very much for having me on the show. It's a real honor. And thank you for that gracious introduction. Yeah, when I was young, as young, I mean, I was in high school, or even junior high school, I decided I wanted to learn something about philosophy. I had no idea what philosophy was, but I guess I wanted to sound like an intellectual. I wanted to sound smart, so I wanted to know what philosophy was. So I went to a bookstore and I grabbed a book off the shelf that was supposed to be an introductory book about philosophy. And honestly, I'm not going to name the author of the book, but after reading the book, I decided, pardon my language, well, philosophy is just BS, you know, based on this book. It's just stupid people arguing about things that don't make any difference and that aren't important. And so I guess I don't need to really know anything about philosophy. But then I was doing interscholastic debate. And so debating current affairs topics with students at other schools. And an issue that was big in the United States at that time was registration for the draft, because the United States doesn't have a draft and did not have a draft during my lifetime, or my young life, but they did reinstitute registration for the draft. So people were interested, well, do you have to register for the draft? If there is a draft, do you have to go? And I started to think about, okay, what are my obligations to the state as an individual? Do I have any obligations to the state? Can the state ask me to kill people, you know, even if I don't have anything against the people I'm being asked to kill? And I realized I had no framework for thinking about these issues. So I went back to read political philosophy, and now it meant something to me because I could see what difference it made. So one of the things I always tell my students when I'm teaching philosophy at any level is, if you're reading philosophy and you don't understand why the people are bothered by these issues, why they matter to them, then you don't understand the philosophy. Because it's a common misconception, one that I had at a certain point, that philosophers they want to argue about these stupid issues that don't make any difference. But it turns out that whether we're talking about Plato in ancient Greece or Confucius in ancient China or the Buddha or more orthodox philosophers in South Asia, they're motivated by real human issues. And even the most seemingly abstract issues are motivated by intense human concerns. And so that's one lesson I learned from my own experience that I try to convey to my students. Real philosophy is motivated by real life problems. That's what I discovered, and that's how I got interested in philosophy.
So do you have a question?
No, yeah.
Okay. So I want to ask, because Bryan, like, my sense is that perhaps in the past, right, it seems like philosophy was a lot more popular, like perhaps mainstream, for lack of a better word. Would you say that the times have changed and philosophy has now become a little bit more esoteric or out of reach for the masses?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, that's a terrific question. I mean, there was a time historically when philosophy, to use that specific term, referring back to the tradition that goes back all the way to people like Plato and Aristotle and before, there was a time when philosophy was identical with the higher liberal arts. And so if you wanted to study astronomy or mathematics or physics or chemistry or biology or psychology, any of those things that we now know by different disciplines, you studied philosophy. So philosophy was really everything in higher education that was not law or medicine or theology. You know, that's the original origin of philosophy. So in a way, you studied philosophy. That's why the doctoral degrees in so many fields are a PhD, a Doctor of Philosophy. So even people who are critics of philosophy, like Neil deGrasse Tyson, ironically have a PhD, a Doctor of Philosophy degree. But then what happens historically is that as fields develop their own methodology, and that methodology becomes like very distinct and very clear, those fields kind of break off from philosophy. So nowadays, because physics has its own methodology, chemistry has its own methodology, and people in the fields largely agree about what the methodology is, although of course there are areas of disagreement, those fields have broken off from philosophy. So what's left over in philosophy, in my view, is the problems that we consider important, but we don't yet agree about the methodology for how to address them. Now, one of the things that you can learn from Thomas Kuhn's seminal book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, and I often tell my students, I say, look, if you get your bachelor's degree and you never read Thomas Kuhn's The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, your degree doesn't count. Because you don't know enough about how the science, with modern natural science, which is one of the major accomplishments of human civilization, but also a very distinctive activity, which is different from what we do in other disciplines. If you don't understand what's distinctive about it, you don't really have a good general education. And Kuhn's book is very useful for doing this. So, but one thing you learn from studying the history of science is that when you're in a period of a scientific revolution, like the kind of scientific revolution by which Darwin's ideas of evolution replaced Aristotle's teleological biology, or the kind of scientific revolution by which Einstein's notions of the relativity of space and time, and the notion that space and time are intertwined in a four-dimensional matrix, replace the earlier Newtonian physics. At those points where there's a scientific revolution, scientists become philosophers, because at those points there's no longer agreement about the right methodology for doing these fields. And so Einstein himself said that he was very indebted to the British empiricist philosopher David Hume, and that reading Hume was very important for giving Einstein the intellectual freedom and breadth that allowed him to develop relativity theory. And Galileo, one of the founders of modern philosophy, was very clear about the influence of Plato on his own conceptions of how science works. So scientists, in short, are usually not philosophers. And what distinguishes science from philosophy is the fact that scientists usually agree about the right methodology for resolving problems, But even in the case of science, when you have a major scientific revolution and you have to revise the foundations of science, at that point, the great physicists and chemists and biologists are also philosophers because they have to rethink the foundations of their discipline. But in general, philosophy is where we argue about things that we agree are important, but we don't yet agree about the methodology for how to resolve them. And if people say, well, but why is philosophy important? It's like, well, precisely because we're motivated to study these seemingly abstract issues because they have real world implications. I can go on about that a bit more if you want, or if you want to interject a question. You want me to continue about that?
Well, I actually was going to ask Ong-Soo, have you met up with Brian's requirement? Did you read Structure of Scientific Revolutions in your philosophy degree?
No, I'm afraid to say that I did not. You know, I've known about it all my life, but haven't actually got around to reading it through. But I will definitely have to go out and read that soon after hearing this.
Well, I've got, I think it's linked to on my website, bryanvannorden.com. And I'm one of those weird people who spells Bryan with a Y, BRYANVANNORDEN.com. I've got a guide to reading Kuhn's The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, because Kuhn's an interesting case because Thomas Kuhn was ABD, as we say in physics. That means he completed all the requirements for his doctorate except for the dissertation, so all but dissertation. And he was at Harvard, and as part of the condition of his fellowship, he had to give a lecture on the history of science, even though that wasn't a major part of his training as a physicist. So Kuhn was trained as a physicist. He has to give this lecture on the history of physics. And I often assign to my students an essay where he talks about this experience. And so Kuhn says that he reads Aristotle and he says, this is so weird. This guy doesn't understand even basic physics. He's so wrong about so many things. But then, and this is what I think is really important, Kuhn says, but I know that Aristotle is regarded as a genius by so many people throughout history, and his ideas were dominant among the greatest intellectuals in Europe for millennia. And there's also his insights about ethics and politics are often very deep. So the guy's not dumb, he's not stupid. So why is he saying these things? And I tell students, that's the way to approach history of philosophy. Don't look at it and say, oh, this guy doesn't, or this woman doesn't think what I think, therefore they're stupid. Probably they're not stupid, or we wouldn't still be reading them. So then he's like, okay, but if he's wrong, but not stupid, how is he making these mistakes? And then eventually Kuhn says, I was just sitting in my office looking out the window on a hot summer day, and I realized biology. This guy's primarily a biologist, and he's trying to apply a biological model to physics. And he's trying to explain things like why a pen falls in terms of why a flower grows the way it does. And he said, all of a sudden, everything Aristotle said made sense to me. I didn't agree with it, but I understood why he was saying it. And that moment, he says, this was what Kuhn would later call a paradigm shift, where you suddenly see everything in the world in a different way. You just change your orientation because you realize what the underlying metaphor is, or what the underlying paradigm case is for this thinker that you're looking at. So, and then after that, Kuhn switched from being a physicist to being a historian. And he wrote this book, The Structure of Scientific Revolution, which it does have a fair amount of technical physics in it. But like I say, the handout I use with my students, which you can find on my website, does help make that explain like what are some of the physical things he's referring to. And also there's another book that some people think is even better than Kuhn, but Against Method by Paul Feyerabend, was written about the same time. And what both of these works are doing is they're calling into question a seemingly persuasive but ultimately misleading view of science. So what is the seemingly persuasive but ultimately wrong view of science that in different ways Kuhn and Feyerabend are calling into question? It's the view that science is about just looking at the world, seeing what's obviously there, performing some experiments that definitively settle the matter, and then boom, you have your facts. And what you get from both Kuhn and Feyerabend is experiences have to be interpreted. There's no such thing as experience that's not filtered through some set of concepts. But because your experience is filtered through concepts, you will, in some sense, see different things looking at the same world if you have different sets of concepts. And this notion is kind of rediscovered by Kuhn and Feyerabend, but it's a notion that you could really find already in Immanuel Kant, who said that our perceptions have to be filtered through what he called the categories of thought. But Kant was in fact reacting to Hume, who had tried to ground human knowledge in direct experience. And Kant said, well, you don't directly experience things. You experience things through what he called categories, what we would call concepts. But then Kant said, all humans, and indeed all rational creatures, all have the same set of concepts. But then the later neo-Kantians said, well, but the concepts may differ depending on the historical era you're in or the culture you're in. And that's how we get a lot of modern thought, which recognizes this fact that, for example, you might see the world in a different way if you have a different cultural background, if you have a different class background, if you have a different racial background, depending on how these things condition your experience of the world. So that's one of the reasons I think it's really important to read. If you haven't read Kuhn, there are things you could read like Kuhn that would give you similar ideas, like I say, Feyerabend, or really if you read Kant really carefully or Hegel really carefully, you'll get similar kinds of ideas.
Yeah, I was going to say, like, you and I, Bryan, so our channel, we both have a similar video title called Why Philosopher Lies. You have one yourself, we have one too. Obviously yours is a lot better because you went through quite an extensive history of philosophy. And I while you were talking a lot about philosophy of science, so I don't really feel like tonight we can cover that too much, but I have read my fair bit of Massimo Pellegrino, and I think like one of the topics he does bring up is that philosophy value adds to human knowledge by asking questions. And philosophy doesn't have a what he calls a non-teleological purpose. So we're not necessarily trying to find like a final absolute answer to many questions in life, but rather philosophy progresses by asking better questions, more nuanced, more sharper questions, and something that can elevate, human knowledge or societal virtues or that kind of goals. But that's not necessarily the explicit purpose. If I got his conclusions right. Santosh, I was just thinking of you when Bryan was talking a lot about paradigm shifts, and I know you have quite a fair bit of things to say about that. You got something you want to add?
No, I think for me, the beauty of philosophy lies in the spirit of philosophy more than the outcome of philosophy. And what I mean by the spirit of philosophy is this whole spirit of intellectual humility, this spirit of contemplation and introspection and self-examination. So these are attitudes that our greatest of philosophers have actually role modeled to us. Yeah. And which we actually learn and we apply to both ourselves and the world with which we deal with. So I think for me, the greatest benefit or inheritance that I've gained from philosophy is really the spirit of inquiry, humility, introspection, and contemplation. Yeah, and really self-examination. And within the realm of self-examination is this whole idea of metacognition, which is to think about the thinking that is going through, that I'm putting something through. Yeah, so thinking about thinking, right? And that is an essential attitude of philosophy that's learned or that's imbibed as you go through a class of philosophy. So that's just my very simple appreciation of the benefit of philosophy, which can be applied to any other discipline or problem of life.
I think that's a great point. And I taught, as we mentioned in the introduction, at Yale NUS College, particularly in the philosophy and political thought sequence, which is required of freshmen. And I think it's a really amazing example of how you can do a multicultural survey of philosophy. I think the faculty, the philosophy faculty at Yale NUS have done a great job developing this course. And the final thing we read when I was teaching in it was an essay by Hannah Arendt called On Thinking. And although there is a bit of a gender problem in philosophy in the sense that historically, because of sexism and patriarchy and even misogyny, women were often denied a philosophical education or the chance to have their own philosophical voices. And this, it's not as bad as it used to be, but these issues continue to the present day. But ironically, the 20th century was in many ways a great century for women philosophers. You had women like Philippa Foot, Iris Murdoch, Elizabeth Anscombe, Hannah Arendt, and in a later generation, Martha Nussbaum, who's still active at the University of Chicago. And Hannah Arendt wrote this great essay on thinking, and one of the points she makes is precisely the point that you've made, which is that thinking, even if it doesn't result in a specific outcome, can be useful. And one of the ways in which it's useful is it takes you out of the action and makes you ask yourself, why am I doing what I'm doing? And sometimes that question can be very socially disruptive, but also very important. So for people in my generation, I mean, I'm not so old that I actually remember World War II, but I'm 58 and I'm old enough to remember. I mean, my father served in the Pacific Theater in World War II. Lots of people I knew served in World War II. And one question people often asked was, how do you have a country like Germany that has a very impressive high cultural tradition and so many educated people who took part in the Nazi movement and the Holocaust? And Arendt has a really complex relationship with this situation because she was not only a student of Martin Heidegger, who was one of the seminal philosophers in the continental tradition in the 20th century, but also an avowed Nazi at one point in his career. But Arendt was not only Heidegger's student, she was his mistress for a while. And so this question, why did people get involved in the Nazi movement? And her answer is basically what it came down to was not thinking, just going along with what everybody else is doing. And I've thought about that today. I mean, I don't want to get too controversial, but there are nascent far-right and fascist movements throughout the Western democracies, including the United States. And Jason Stanley has written a great recent book on fascism, where he identifies some of the features that are characteristic of fascist movements throughout history. And you can just check off every one of these is part of contemporary right-wing discourse in the United States today. And I know people who are, very enthusiastic about this movement. And you say, well, how could smart people, educated people be involved in these things? We see Hannah Arendt's ideas again. If you don't ask questions, if you don't think, if you just accept passively the worldview that's given to you, you can end up believing anything. So there's a lot of value to be said just for taking time out to ask yourself, why do I believe what I do? And when I teach my students, a lot of times what I'm just trying to make clear to them is, say, look, I have members of my immediate, not my immediate family, but my larger family, including siblings and things, who are, huge Trump supporters. I'm personally not, I was a Trump opponent. And so I have and so I can respect and care about you regardless of what your personal political views are. But I want you to understand what the philosophical implications are and what the presuppositions are of the positions that you take. And so a lot of what I'm trying to do is just get students to see more clearly, this is what you have to think to make sense out of this view that you're defending, or this is what underlies the political philosophy that you are espousing.
So let me jump in here, because I actually dug up your history, right? And I found out, so just a clarification for us, like Angsu and Santosh and me, I think from our channel, it's quite evident that we're pretty left-leaning progressives. So that's kind of like our political stance. But I found out from your interview, Bryan, that your father was the chairman of the Republican Party at one point. You were brought up to be a conservative. You espouse admiration for Milton Friedman. For our viewers, that's the grandfather of free market capitalism. But in the same interview, you mentioned, and I quote you, "The Republican Party keeps driving me to the left." So let's talk a bit about that, the kind of key experiences or reasons. And I read your book, so I'm quite well aware of some of the arguments you made, but just for our viewers, you could go into that. But the other thing I also want to ask you, Bryan, is I also sometimes wonder at this assumption that can knowledge really deliver salvation, right? In the sense that you make the right moves, make the right decisions, be more humane. Because as history does show, there are some very brilliant people who have, unfortunately, stood on the side of injustice, oppression, and atrocity. So, what are we to make of that? If history does show knowledge isn't a guarantor, unfortunately, we would like to think of it that way, but it doesn't seem to be.
Well, yeah, terrific questions. Yeah, I come from a very politically conservative background. One thing that I think is hard for people who, I think even many people in the United States don't get this, but I think it's especially difficult if you're not from the United States, that it looks like there's a liberal political party in the United States, the Democrats, and then there's a conservative party, the Republicans. And it's an easy way to think about US politics. But realistically, this will be very controversial to some people in the United States, but I think it's actually very obvious. Where the United States Democratic Party is politically now is where the US Republican Party was when I was young in, say, the 1970s, right? So Nixon would be far too left-wing to make it in the contemporary US President Richard Nixon, who's notoriously conservative president, far too left-wing to make it in the contemporary Republican Party. But he would fit just fine in the mainstream Democratic Party of today. And if I'm not mistaken, I think Hillary Clinton actually had a similar trajectory where she was originally a Republican, but then when it became clear that the Republican Party was not serious about racial integration, she switched to the Democratic Party, but she's basically a pretty conservative person in a lot of political and economic issues. So in the United States today, we don't have a left-wing party and a right-wing party. We have a center-right party, which is the US Democratic Party. And the US Democratic Party is center-right by any reasonable international standard. And then we've got a far-right party, which is the Republican Party. And again, if you look at things like Jason Stanley's book on this, the rhetoric that is used by the contemporary Republican Party, especially as it's become Trumpist, is, the rhetoric that's characteristic of the far right historically. One of the things that to me is really interesting is if you look at far right movements throughout the 20th and 21st century, they call everybody who disagrees with them a communist. And that's classic US political discourse. Everybody on the right is, if you say anything that disagrees with the Republican Party, you're a communist. It could be the most, it could be the most comparatively neoliberal thing in the world, but like, oh, it's communism if it's not, the Republican Party. So I didn't abandon the Republican Party. The Republican Party, abandoned me. And some of my left-wing friends tease me about it. They just said, look, you look like a Republican. A lot of times you talk like a Republican. You're this old, white guy who loves ancient thought. You're a classic conservative. Like I would be if the Republican Party were anywhere near where I was. So I've ended up, becoming more left-wing as time has gone on. And partly it's also just understanding better the nature of US political disagreement and understanding what people really stand for. So to pick an obvious example, some of the issues in the United States are US football players, especially led by African-American football players, have been kneeling during the national anthem as a peaceful way of protesting violence against African Americans by US police. And even if you look at the police's own statistics, by the police's own statistics, they are more prone to use violence and a higher level of violence against African Americans than against white people doing the same things. So there's this peaceful protest on the part of athletes, and a lot of people are just outraged by this, like, oh, it's so offensive to the flag, to kneel during the national anthem. And on the face of it, that sounds sensible, but then you ask the same people, oh, well, if you're offended by people kneeling during the national anthem, you must be really offended by the many people in the United States who fly Confederate flags. And Confederate flags, if you don't know US history, that's the flags of the traitors to the United States who waged war against the United States and caused more than 500,000 deaths in the mid-19th century in the US Civil War, in which Confederates were fighting for slavery and against the United States. And so if you're like, well, the Confederate flag, that's people flying the Confederate flag, that's just expressing their cultural values and you've got to respect their freedom of speech. But then you're like, oh, players kneeling during the national anthem, that's offensive to the United States. It's not about being offensive to the United States or the flag if you combine those two values, right? So to some extent, I've been driven to the left just by realizing, what's, I think, really going on underlying some issues in the United States, and just, again, asking people to be consistent. If you're all about, like, let's respect the United States, let's respect the flag, you must hate the monuments to Confederates who were traitors to our countries and flying the Confederate flag. Oh, no, they're okay. It's like, well, then it's not about respecting the country, is it? So that's been part of my political transformation. I think you had another question that I lost somewhere in there, but
well, this really is an abstract one. It's just really about the power of knowledge, and does it really empower someone to be less prone to, say, conspiracy thought or to fascist politics if someone's more knowledgeable? Yeah, it's obviously a very abstract question.
No, but I think it's a good one, and I know we don't want to get too deep into philosophy here, but I'm a big fan of multicultural philosophy, different intellectual traditions. And, you mentioned, this book you read this weekend where I talk about the value of, multicultural philosophical traditions. But there is one insight that I think people had in the Western tradition, the tradition, the European tradition, that's really deep. The ancient Greeks were very interested, and I have a YouTube lecture on this, weakness of will in Chinese philosophy. The ancient Greeks were very interested in the puzzle of how someone can apparently know what the right thing is to do, but not do it. And Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle all have opinions on what they call weakness of will, or akrasia, which is the phenomenon of someone seeming to know the right thing to do, but not doing it. The example I originally gave this YouTube lecture at Yale NUS as part of the philosophy and political thought sequence. And I said, my example would be, there's a gym in between my office and the apartment I live in off campus. And it's so easy for me to visit the gym on the way home. And I know I'll have a longer, healthier life if I regularly go to the gym, and I end up not going to the gym. So how do I not do what I know is good for me in the long run? That's the problem of weakness of will. And they have various theories about it. But then in a few generations later, St. Augustine comes along after the advent of Christianity. And inspired by some things he reads in the New Testament, particularly the letters of the Apostle Paul, Augustine says, well, what the Greeks, he doesn't quite put it this way, but one way of looking at it is, what the Greeks missed was, you have knowledge and you have desire or passion. But then you've got a third faculty, which is your will. And the orientation of your will determines the orientation of your knowledge, and it determines the orientation of your passions. And nothing can, the will is more fundamental than these other things. So the orientation, the way he put it is, the orientation of your will is towards earthly things. Your knowledge will only be of earthly things, and your desire will only be of earthly things. If the orientation of your will is upward towards the transcendent realm of God, then your knowledge will be of God and your motivations will be of God. This is, I think, a really deep idea. And at the end of the day, knowledge, I think, by itself isn't enough. You have to make a decision about whether you're going to choose to be on one side or the other. And on the one hand, that's kind of saddening because it means that you can have really well-educated Nazis. And if you look among the Nazis, some of the Nazis were really quite cultured and quite well-educated. Some of them were very ignorant, but some of them were very well-educated. But they chose, their will went a certain direction, I should point down. Their will went in a certain direction, and that influenced everything they did. And likewise, there are, some, bright people, who nonetheless can sign on for fascism. And so on the one hand, I say it's depressing because it'd be nice if we could just educate people into being better people. On the other hand, and this is part of Augustine's point, part of what makes humans godlike is this capacity to choose good or evil. And that fundamental capacity to choose good or evil is what distinguishes us from doggies and cats. And I'm a big dog and cat lover, but I don't think they choose between good and evil the way we do. And so part of what's distinctive about human beings is this fact that we can choose to be good or evil. That being said, I think, again, right now, if you look at the political spectrum in the US, it used to be the case in the US that there were intellectually defensible ways to be conservative or liberal. Now, a lot of what we're seeing on the part of the far right is just a complete rejection of knowledge. And so there are people who don't know anything about vaccinations or how they work, who are opposed to vaccinations. I was talking to a friend in Norway recently, and she was really stunned when I explained there are a lot of Americans who can get vaccinations and they refuse to do it because they think that the vaccination is putting some kind of secret tracking or mind control microchip in them, or it's literally it's satanic to get a vaccination. It's like of the devil. This is something that people are just take really seriously in the United States. There is a quite vibrant flat earth movement in the United States. People who believe the earth is literally flat, like this, like flat like this, and they don't believe the earth is a sphere. The QAnon conspiracy, which again, if viewers are not familiar with US politics, a lot of Americans believe that there's a secret source to inside government information called Q, and this secret source of government information was telling them that Donald Trump is part of a secret team that is getting rid of a cult of pedophile high-level Democrats who are harvesting adrenochrome from this chemical from babies, and Trump is out to get them, and they believe that Trump's about to be reinstated as president this month. I mean, just crazy, crazy, crazy stuff. And the invasion of Trump supporters by the US Capitol, if you look at the tapes, they're looking for evidence of the secret cult that they think is going on. And so, I'm sorry, that's my phone. I thought I silenced that. I always tell students to silence their phones before class, and I didn't do it myself.
What disciplinary action do you give if the phone rang?
What's that?
Disciplinary action if
I just smile at them because I got that that grandpa thing going where I can just smile and they feel bad. So that's one of the advantages of being an older grandpa looking guy. But anyway, a lot of the point is there's a lot of anti-intellectualism in the United States. So actually, if people in the US were, and this is something that people have pointed out before, Douglas Hofstadter was a great US historian, and he wrote a classic book many decades ago, Anti-Intellectualism in American Life. And Alexis de Tocqueville was a French visitor to the United States in the 18th century, and he wrote a book called Democracy in America, and he said that the United States' great strength, but also its great weakness is we think everybody's equal. And on the one hand, that's really great because we don't stand on aristocratic backgrounds, the fact that your ancestors were dukes or duchesses, whatever, we don't care. But on the other hand, it means that the average person in the US really thinks they know as much as an MD or a PhD in some area. I don't want to throw my relatives under the bus, so to speak. I don't know if that people use that. That's an American expression. Throw them under the bus means like, you know, blame that guy for something. But I had a relative who sent me a blog post by an 18-year-old student critiquing my book. And the relative hadn't read my book, but sent me this blog post explaining what's wrong with my book. And it's like, that's a very American thing to do. It's like, oh, you've been studying this for 30 years and you've written a book about it? Well, here's a blog post by an 18-year-old that I think explains something I'm sure you didn't think about when you're writing a book. That's so American to think that, you know, I don't need to research this topic. I think it's hard for people sometimes, again, in outside the US to understand just how rabidly anti-intellectual most Americans are, and how they think that, yeah, you don't, people in the US literally think if you've read less about a topic, you know more about it than people who are well-educated. People who are supposedly well-educated know less about this topic than you do. People really believe that in the US. So I think it would actually help US politics anyway if people took more seriously actual experts and were more informed on topics. But there is a kind of almost rabid anti-intellectualism in the US.
Yeah, I'd like to weigh in, if I can, with an alternative view. I don't know if you've heard of this book, The Enigma of Reason by Hugo Mercier. He's a French philosopher. But when I read it, it really intrigued me because his hypothesis, which he argues for in the book, is that reason and rationality did not evolve to find out the truth about the world or any objective reality. They actually evolved to fulfill our social needs. So when we give reasons for something, it's actually for social consumption. It's to signal to others in our group that they can rely on us for, you know, future behavior that requires cooperation. So what we're seeing around in the world and in the US, which we think of as the failure of reason, may actually be reason actually functioning exactly as evolution designed it to, which means, you know, I'm more likely to be a flat earther if everyone in my social group is also a flat earther, and you know, it's in my interest to give reasons that I think they would buy into. So I'm curious what you think of that.
Yeah, I think in one level, I think that is a very good insight. And it was actually someone I follow on social media, another philosopher, Helen de Cruz, had made a similar point. I don't know if she'd read the same book, but she said, well, there's two things you want with knowledge claims. I mean, on the one hand, you do want your knowledge claims to actually be accurate about the world, but you also want knowledge claims because they help coordinate actions with your in-group. And that explains a lot of what people say. It's like, and many people I know, again, who can be very smart, but they want to fit in. They want to believe the same things that their in-group believes. And they're really afraid of being rejected by their in-group or shamed by their in-group. So they tend to believe the things that their in-group believes. I think that's part of it. But there's a general line of argument that I'm skeptical of, and I've heard before, which is people saying, well, look, we don't know the truth about reality because we didn't evolve to understand the world. We evolved to get out of the rain when it's raining, or we evolved to, you know, avoid the saber-toothed tiger, not to know the truth about the saber-toothed tiger. But there's kind of a paradox about arguments like that, because if that were true, then we also can't know the truth about how we evolved, right? So all we are is just dumb little primates who just know to, you know, eat nuts and get out of the rain. How do we come up with evolutionary theory? And it's a common thing I see as a philosopher, where people will say, well, here's a very subtle reasoned argument for being skeptical of our rational capacities. Well, if we're skeptical of our rational capacities, we don't know that argument against our rational capacities either. And so because I've heard this kind of evolutionary argument, I think, I mean, again, I don't want to, I'll try to phrase this in a way that's kind of open and not too technical, but one issue that's been, and you guys know this, very big in philosophy is, does natural science tell us everything there is to know about the world? Now, on the one hand, natural science has been so successful in giving us plausible accounts of the world, and not just plausible accounts, but accounts that we can, in many cases, test or build things, like we can send rockets to the moon and send people there and bring them back. And these are just really impressive accomplishments, and like diseases that, like infections that would have killed anybody a couple hundred years ago, now we can easily survive with antibiotics or treatments. I was watching, we were really enjoying the show Vikings, which is a historical drama, and it's not completely historically accurate, but the general, you know, trends about like the Viking invasions of Europe and things are in fact accurate. And an English king, I didn't double check the historicity of this, but it seems plausible. An English king died of a bee sting. Now, you can die of a bee sting, but usually if you don't die right away, we just take you to the ER, we give you some epinephrine, you're fine. You know, you're going to be fine. But just one example of ways in which our technology now is just very impressive. So because science is so successful in so many ways, it's tempting to think, well, maybe the only things to know about the world are scientific facts, and maybe the only methodology for understanding anything is a scientific methodology. And some people who present themselves as spokespeople for science, like I mentioned Neil deGrasse Tyson earlier, and you know, so other figures, Stephen Hawking, before he passed away, was saying, well, look, natural science really tells you everything that you need to know about the world. Every philosophy is just, as Neil deGrasse Tyson put it, philosophy, Neil deGrasse Tyson said, can really mess you up. So, but I think that science can never tell you anything about the world. And one way of understanding that is there's not a scientific test for telling you whether science answers all the questions in the world, because it would be circular to use a scientific test to show that science tells you everything about the world. So there's always going to be things that science can't tell you about the world. Those are going to be the philosophical questions. And one way of phrasing this in more technical terminology is there any way in which our consciousness of the world is transcendent or transcendental, in the sense that it gives us access to facts about the world which aren't reducible to scientific facts? And I think it does. I think there are some facts about the world that aren't scientific facts. I think that there are some methodologies for understanding the world that aren't scientific methodologies in any interesting sense of science. And I think it's that kind of you know, understanding of the world that allows us to do things like understand Shakespeare, right? So if someone read Shakespeare's Macbeth, one of my favorite plays, and said, you know, what I've learned from this is Lady Macbeth is the hero of Macbeth, and you know, the basic thing is you got to go for it in life. That's what I learned from Macbeth. That's a really bad reading of Macbeth. You did not understand Macbeth. And so, but is that a scientific claim? Can I perform an experiment to prove that's a wrong interpretation of Macbeth? No. But it is an indefensible interpretation of Macbeth, and I can tell you why. It's just a trivial example to illustrate there are a lot of things we know about the world that we don't know as a matter of scientific fact, and then therefore many truths about the world that aren't reducible to scientific truths. That doesn't mean that science is not wonderful. Science is wonderful, and I believe in it. And insofar as science is telling me about science facts, I believe those science facts. But the question is there more to reality than what science tells us? I think there is.
Okay, so Bryan, just to bring us back to ground level, so that was really a beautiful explanation about where the value of science lies, and also at the same time where philosophy can value add. So I do encourage our viewers to actually look up a little bit more. Even in your book, you did talk a little bit quite extensively about the value of the history and philosophy of science. But you know, just earlier you did mention all of the messiness and chaos that's happening in the US political and social scene, and hence that brings us to your article on the ignorant do not have a right to an audience. So you actually won the Public Philosophy Op-Ed Prize in 2019 for that article. So just to say that the article was quite well received, garnered a lot of feedback, obviously. And I just want to tell the viewers, right, that so you drew on many examples, right, on and let's be blunt here, ignorant but also very irresponsible celebrities, politicians, conservative talk show hosts, and the way they promoted false statements. And the most egregious to me is Alex Jones, the conservative talk show host, who sold the idea that the Sandy Hook massacre is a false flag operation, and that led to the families of the victims being hounded by stalkers, by Alex Jones followers for years, and he took the courts to actually get them off their backs. So I just want to clarify for our audiences that, of course, in your article, you are not saying that the ignorant do not have a right to free speech. They do have the right to free speech, but rather what you're arguing is that they should be prevented from having access to public institutions and media, because these institutions themselves should be mindful about what kind of views and beliefs are acceptable for discourse. So, so just to say before we talk about this, right, you actually have a 1 hour long video on your YouTube just addressing this issue. So what we're going to discuss here tonight is really cliff notes. But you actually base your argument on certain philosophical ideas, and I thought you could perhaps expound on that, and then we can discuss a little bit more about it.
Yeah, great. Yeah, so the original article, as you point out, was published in the New York Times. The ignorant do not have a right to an audience. And I'm critiquing a view that was originally defended by John Stuart Mill in On Liberty, which has been an immensely influential work. And if you guys, if people in the audience haven't read it, I would recommend reading it. Mill's also a fun writer. And it's not an incredibly long book. It's not a very technical book. And it has, if people say philosophy is not important, the influence of John Stuart Mill on the English legal tradition and actual cases in free speech has been huge. So it's very influential. But Mill's work on liberty has also been critiqued, among others, by Herbert Marcuse, who was a leading Marxist philosopher in the 20th century. So I'm developing some ideas from Marcuse in the critique of Mill. So Mill's argument is it's charmingly simple. Mill says, look, if somebody's saying something, there are only three possibilities. What they're saying is true, what they're saying is false, or what they're saying is partly true and partly false. Well, if what somebody's saying is true, we shouldn't limit their freedom of speech to express that truth, because it can only be to our benefit to discover true things about the world. If what they're saying is partially true and partially false, well, how are we going to get to that partial truth about the world unless we hear what they say and give them the freedom to express it? Now you might say, well, but what if what they're saying is wholly false? And Mill says, well, first of all, there are many things that people once thought were obviously false that turned out to be true. So for example, people thought it was obvious that the Earth was the center of the solar system and the sun went around it, the geocentric hypothesis. By the way, my cat Pinky would like to say hi. I pulled into my lap unbidden, as she often likes to do.
Yeah, please show your pets, yes.
Yes, and so, but so if what you're saying is you think it's completely false, well, some things that turned out to be true, like the claim that the sun is the center of the solar system and the Earth goes around it, were once thought to be false. So maybe this thing that you're sure is false is one of those things. And how are we going to find out if it's actually false or not unless we look at it? And then finally, Mill says, look, even if it really is false, and there's no question about it being false, we will benefit and understand the truth better by considering the arguments against the truth that are raised by this alternative position. So it's a very, powerful argument for essentially almost unlimited freedom of speech. But what I say in the article is the opportunities for audiences for what you're saying are limited. So it's not like just anybody who wants to can give a talk at a major university like an Ivy League university. It's not like just anybody who wants to can be interviewed on CNN. It's not like I can go online and like, well, just put my name on the list to be interviewed by CNN, or to give a I've had publications in the New York Times, but not everybody can do that. So the audience spots are limited for major places where you can get your word across to the public. And what Marcuse points out is often the people who get those audience spots are people who either have demonstrably ignorant views, or their views that fit into the contemporary narrative of society, and they reinforce beliefs that people would already like to have. You mentioned Alex Jones. Another example, one of the examples I raised in the article is Charles Murray. Charles Murray wrote a book called The Bell Curve. I don't recommend anybody read it. Murray's book has been debunked repeatedly, and his sources have been shown to be unreliable. His methodology has been shown to be fallacious repeatedly. And what does Murray argue? Murray argues that the different scores on IQ tests can be correlated to intrinsic differences between different races, and that these differences in races are objective and unchangeable facts about various races. Now, there are a bunch of things wrong with this argument. One thing to keep in mind, independently of what you think of the arguments, is Charles Murray has admitted to burning a cross. Now, if you don't know the symbolism of race in the United States, burning a cross, you might say, oh, this is some kind of anti-Christian thing. No, burning crosses is a methodology used by the far right in the United States to intimidate African Americans and people of other non-white races. And Murray admits to having done this. He doesn't even dispute that he, in fact, he's a cross burner. In addition, among the sources used in Murray's book are a journal founded by an avowed Nazi. And the statistical methods he used are flawed, both because, as any serious scientist will tell you, race is not a scientific category. Our category of race was invented by imperialists and nationalists in the 19th century and does not reflect real biological categories. So any supposedly scientific generalizations you make based on race are intrinsically pseudoscientific, because race isn't a real biological category, it's a social category. I'm of Polish descent, and many Americans don't know this, but people of Polish descent were not considered Caucasian or white in the early 20th century, right? Why? Because people said, oh, the Eastern Europeans, or people like Italians or Poles, they're not really white. They have low IQs, they're prone to crime, they're prone to violence. They're not even really Christian because they're Catholic, not real Christian like Protestants. These are things people actually said in the early 20th century. So, but it just shows the way in which notions of race are just socially constructed. And there are just basic statistical errors in Murray's reasoning. So, for example, it used to be a common observation by people in the United States. They said, like, well, people in East Asia are shorter than people in the United States. And for a long time, that was in fact true. Now, by Murray's reasoning, oh, so people in East Asia were shorter, therefore this is an objective genetic fact about people in East Asia that can't be changed. One of the things I notice every time I go to East Asia is young people are taller than I am now in China and other parts of East Asia. Why? Because diet changed. It used to be that people in the US traditionally have had a very meat-heavy diet, heavy protein, so children tend to grow very tall. People are having a much more meat-intensive diet in East Asia, including China, and so yeah, young people are really tall now. And so it's the same thing about, again, any attachment of IQ to race is going to be pseudoscientific because race isn't a scientific category. But even if you find a correlation, there's no reason to believe that reflects some kind of intrinsic quality any more than Americans being taller than people in Japan or China reflected an intrinsic genetic quality of people in the US or China or Japan. So, and I went on at length about this because Murray keeps getting invited to give talks on television, and a number of prestigious colleges and universities have invited him to give talks. Why? Well, at least one of these institutions I know, they said, well, it's a John Stuart Mill type argument. Even though we know what he's saying is false, we will learn more about the truth by engaging with him. I don't think that's the case. I think the message it sends to students is, we've invited this person to campus, so obviously this is a view that we should take seriously. You may not agree with it, but why'd you invite him to campus unless this is a view that intelligent people take seriously? It's not a position that intelligent people take seriously. And you're sending a message to students of color that you take seriously a view that says that they are intrinsically genetically inferior. And it sends a message to white students that we take seriously the view that the racial hierarchies that exist in the United States as a matter of culture are based in genuine genetic differences. And so, and if you say, well, but don't you have to allow everybody to talk? You don't allow everybody to talk. You never do. You know, we don't invite flat earthers to give talks. The, geography department doesn't invite flat earthers to give a talk. And so we shouldn't be inviting people whose work has been completely discredited, like Charles Murray.
Okay, I was just seeing where the other guys had something to comment. So my questions are these, right? And I'm sure you've received similar feedback, which is, who would determine who is the ignorant? So there will be one gate control question. And in your opinion, right? So what qualities would you be looking for to determine if someone is suitably, is suitable to participate in public discourse? And, I ask this question because it also pertains to us, because, how do we make sure that we are also not part of the ignorant that should be deplatformed, right? Because I think for like all of us here, we know that we are not professors or academics. And yet at the same time, we feel like it's important for us to have a voice and to contribute to discourse. We of course try our best to make sure that what we say is accurate, factual, but there's always disagreements. There's always, for example, sometimes we don't have access to the data itself. So it's supposed to, we were to criticize public policy, we don't always have complete access to data. So that's my question, which is, how would you educate situations like this, complexities like this?
Yeah, great questions. Yeah, often one of the first questions people raise is they'll say, well, who's going to make a decision, about who is worthy of having an audience or being invited to campus or being interviewed on CNN? And my response is always, who's making the decisions now? I'm not saying somebody different should make the decisions, because people are making the decisions. Again, there's a common unspoken assumption that, oh, well, right now it's a complete free market. Anybody who wants to can get on CNN. Anybody who wants to can get an invitation to give a talk at Columbia University, where Charles Murray is giving a talk. That is false. No, I mean, if there is, show me the website where I go to put my name down to be interviewed on CNN. Oh, terrific, I'll be interviewed by CNN tomorrow, right? I teach Chinese philosophy. I'm almost never invited to give talks on Chinese philosophy at top universities in the United States, because, as I talked about in the editorial I co-wrote with Jay Garfield, if philosophy won't diversify, let's call it what it really is, which is to say, let's just call American philosophy Anglo-European philosophy, because that's what it really is. It's ignoring, most US philosophy departments ignore Chinese philosophy. So I know it is not the case that everybody gets to give talks everywhere. So people are making decisions right now. And if all I'm asking is that people say, okay, so you're telling me that Charles Murray makes a plausible case that deserves to be taken seriously, and that's why you invited him to campus. Don't tell me, oh, we're inviting him just because we invite everybody. No, you do not, right? You've made a decision that of all the people you could invite, this is the person you're going to invite. Or Jenny McCarthy is a grade C actor and entertainer at best. She was interviewed by Larry King, who's was a major talk show host in the United States, for over an hour about her views on vaccinations. Now, does Jenny McCarthy have a degree in medicine or epidemiology, or does she even have an undergraduate degree in biology? No, she does not. But she's a grade Z celebrity who believes the discredited theories about the dangers of vaccination, and she gets to be on TV for a while. Why didn't you interview an actual expert on this topic instead of wasting your time with a grade Z celebrity, right? So I'm saying the same people can make the decisions who are making them now, but hey, tell me, if you're going to invite this person to campus or you're going to give this person a platform, are you saying that you think they have something valuable to contribute to the conversation? Don't fall back on the million defense of, well, but we'll be better off just hearing what they have to say. Will we? Will we actually know the truth better? Do people know the truth about vaccinations? Have they heard everything there is to hear from actual experts on these topics? Have they heard from actual experts on topics about race? Another example is there's been a kind of people have described it as a panic in the US about critical race theory. And so a lot of people on the right in the United States are saying, oh, we have to stamp out critical race theory because it's poisoning your children's minds. And one of the things you'll often hear is you have to stop critical race theory in your schools. You have to outlaw it, right? Which, after all, if you're saying you have to prevent teachers from teaching about something, you're not defending Mill's views on free speech. Let's be clear about that, right? So that's one thing. But when people speak out against critical race theory, one thing I'll often hear is people saying critical race theory wants to tell your children that they're bad just because of the color of their skin. One of the basic, look, if you know nothing else about critical race theory, one of the commitments of critical race theory is that race is a social construct and you can't look at somebody's skin and determine their race. So if that's your slogan, you got to get rid of critical race theory because it's telling your children they're bad because of the color of their skin. No, it's not, because critical race theory rejects the notion that race is a real category that you can identify based on skin color. The notion that race is identified with skin color was one of the things that was at the foundation of categorizing people hierarchically, which developed in the 19th century with the notion of race. By the way, fun tidbit, this blew my mind when I discovered it, but Jesuit missionaries, of course, went to China and other parts of East Asia, arriving at the very beginning of the 17th century, trying to convert people to Christianity. But they also learned a lot about East Asian cultures and conveyed that knowledge to the West, which led to an explosion of interest and initially a favorable interest in East Asian cultures. But and one of the things that the missionaries brought to China was painting with oil painting, which was a European thing, whereas people paint with ink in East Asia. When the missionaries first painted people in China, they gave them the same skin tone as Europeans, right? Because, and again, honestly, when I'm with my friends in East Asia, I don't look at them and I'm not trying to be politically correct here. It's just, I don't look at my friends in China and say, oh yeah, you guys all have yellow skin tone. No, that you don't. I have more of a yellow skin tone than most of my Chinese friends. But so the Jesuits initially correctly drew their Chinese friends with skin tones like Westerners. Then, as the pseudoscientific notions of race developed and categorized people by skin color, they started to paint Chinese people with yellow skin because their theory told them that people in China have a different skin color, and that's how you identify different races. Are you yellow? Are you red? Are you brown? Are you white? That's how you categorize races. And this goes back to our earlier discussion of Kuhn's notion of paradigms. And so the paradigm you have influences literally how you view the world. And do you view people in a continent as having a certain color skin because your theory tells you they're supposed to have that skin color? It's a good way of illustrating how our concepts, or in Kantian terms, our categories, influence the way we actually perceive the world. But so like, this is a simple example. If you say, well, I don't know, maybe this guy is criticizing critical race theory, knows what he's talking about. Did he just say the critical race theory is about categorizing people based on skin color? Because that's precisely what critical race theory denies. Well, then we know we can't take this guy seriously. So sometimes
there's actually, like, I'm not sure whether you're aware of this, probably not, because in Singapore, we are now starting to have a little bit of discussion about critical race theory. Because of the Chinese press, they've brought it into their discourse, into their op-eds, because they are worried about a rising voice about Chinese privilege in Singapore. And actually, it's one of the questions I wanted to ask you tonight, but I felt that we need to go through Confucian philosophy first before I ask you about it, because the idea is that like among the Chinese in Singapore, like they are starting to accuse the insertion of critical race theory, and as if that is responsible for the minorities in Singapore having more of a race critical conscience. And they want to dispute the idea of having Chinese privilege in Singapore existing. So, so we talk about that later, because I actually wanted to first draw on your expertise in Confucian philosophy, and of course, you know, bring in the idea, the thesis that you have about how the Western canon of philosophy is pretty much racist or xenophobic. So let me first say something first. So for me, like before I got to know about you, my impression of Confucius is pretty tarnished by the legacy of Lee Kuan Yew, because Lee Kuan Yew's way of ruling Singapore is, which is considerably draconian and authoritarian, has always been associated with Neo-Confucianism. So in that sense, for the longest of time, I never really cared very much about reading Confucius. And then when I read your book, right, you actually talk about how Confucius is a very divided figure within China. How for the left, he is still seen as a symbol of feudalism, but for the right, you know, he's seen as a symbol of Chinese civilization. And then there was also something that you mentioned about how even for most modern Chinese right now, like the US NBA is even more relevant than Confucius, because Confucius is now pretty much you know, very remote from their memory. So in any case, I felt like perhaps you can first elaborate and talk about Confucius, and you know, just to kind of clarify what he really was, what his main arguments were, and you know, what did we get wrong about him, or maybe the way political leaders get wrong about him. Yeah, Ong, so do you have something to add? Because you know, just in case you have something to add about Asian philosophy, or Santosh.
Not at this point. I'd like to hear what Bryan has to say about Confucius. But maybe Santosh, I mean, you haven't said anything in a while. Do you have?
No, I'll wait for Bryan first. Yeah, let's talk about Confucius. Yeah, that's a great topic.
Right. Well, just a little like general background. As I said, when the Jesuit missionaries first wrote back about their experiences and the culture they were learning about in China, and the English word Confucius is a Latinization invented by the Jesuit missionaries based on one of the less common forms of the name of Confucius in Chinese, Kongfuzi, normally just a Kongzi. But Confucius is a Latinization. So actually it comes from the Jesuits. And initially people were very positive about philosophy in East Asia. But then with the rise of pseudoscientific racism, especially in like the 19th century, the notion developed that only white people can do philosophy. And philosophy only originated in ancient Greece. And Peter K.J. Park has a great book on Africa, Asia, and the rise of the Western philosophical canon that I recommend to everybody interested in this topic. And he documents the change in attitudes that occurred in Europe through textbooks, which initially looked very favorably on philosophy existing and even being born in either Africa or South Asia, and looked very positively on philosophy in East Asia and even indigenous philosophical traditions in the Americas. But with Kant, and I'm a fan of Kant, obviously, in a lot of ways, but in fairness, Kant and the later followers of Kant were really seminal in rewriting the history of philosophy in Europe and writing Africa, Asia, and East Asia out of the history of philosophy. And Kant himself said in his lectures that only white people are capable of philosophy. And he said the Chinese and what he called the Hindus were one step below the whites. And he said they're very talented in many ways, but they'll never be able to do philosophy. And beneath that is people of African descent who he said can only be servants, his words. And then beneath that are the indigenous people of the Americas who are even lower than that and just, you know, can barely even keep themselves alive. And this became the dominant view that philosophy is only something that's done in the European tradition going back to Plato and Aristotle, and it exists nowhere else. And I like to say my contemporary colleagues, at least most of them, would reject the outright racism of Kant's account, but they take it for granted. They accept the fruits of Kant's account, which is that there never was any philosophy in South Asia or East Asia or Africa or the indigenous tradition of the Americas. And they'll say this even if they admit, they've made no effort to read anything about philosophy in these traditions. So that's why to this day, only about 10% of doctoral programs in philosophy in the United States have anyone on staff who teaches Chinese philosophy. Considerably fewer than 10% have anyone who teaches Indian or South Asian philosophy. It's African-American philosophy, you have some representation, but actual African philosophy, again, very, very little representation in doctoral programs in philosophy. So, and this is the fruit of earlier structural racism. And it shows you how complicated the issue is, because again, if you ask most of my colleagues, do you think that people are intellectually inferior in, say, East Asia? They're going to say no. But if you say, oh, so do you teach any East Asian philosophy in your department? Like, oh no, there is no philosophy in East Asia. Have you tried to read any books about, like say Chinese philosophy, like maybe an actual book about it? No, I haven't, but it's all just fortune cookies, right? Adults will say this stuff. So that's where we're at now. But yeah, the history of Confucius is complicated because Confucius has been a controversial figure from the beginning. Sometimes you get this picture that like, oh, everybody's always loved Confucius in East Asian traditions. Absolutely not true. Confucius was controversial during his lifetime. The Moists, which was an early philosophical school opposed to the Confucians on many things, were very critical of Confucianism, of Confucians as people, and of Confucius himself as an individual. And of course, the Chinese Marxists, it's complicated. Liu Shaoqi was a leading figure in 20th century communism and an ally of Mao Zedong. Liu Shaoqi actually wrote this brilliant synthesis of Confucianism and Marxism. His book is available free online under the horrible title, How to Be a Good Communist, which sounds just ridiculous in English. The actual Chinese title is Lun Gongchang Dangyuan, the Shouyang, which is on the ethical cultivation of Communist Party members, which sounds a lot smarter, but the translation is like How to Be a Good Communist, which sounds like a joke. But it's an effort by Liu Shaoqi to synthesize Marxist thought with Confucianism. However, during the Cultural Revolution, Liu Shaoqi was purged by Mao Zedong and died in prison. So in the Cultural Revolution, Marxism became very anti-Confucian. Then after Mao died and Deng Xiaoping opened up China and liberalized China, people kind of tolerated Confucianism. But now under Xi Jinping is actually endorsing Confucianism. I've written an article about the Confucian roots of Xi Jinping's policies, which I actually originally published in the Straits Times when I was in China. And I've said repeatedly in print, I think Xi Jinping's appropriation of Confucianism is opportunistic. So many people in China no longer take Marxism seriously. Officially, China's government is Marxist, but realistically, a lot of people are just like, look around, it's a capitalist country. Come on. There are some people who take Marxism seriously, but they take it seriously in the sense that they think someday, far in the future, we'll achieve a communist utopia. That affects nothing I'm doing right now. And so the dialectic of history will eventually give us a communist utopia. It's the way some Christians in the US, and I'm not just dismissing Christianity in general, but some Christians in the US are like, oh yeah, I believe in God and I believe the second coming will happen. That has no difference to how I'm going to act on a day-to-day basis. But someday God will bring a kingdom of heaven on earth, and that makes me feel comfortable with everything I'm doing right now. So since a lot of people don't take Marxism seriously, Xi Jinping is looking for an ideology that will give people something to believe in, but that will not be subversive of the government. And since Confucian political philosophy is broadly paternalistic and communitarian, or some people would use the term perfectionist, he thinks that's more in line with the paternalism of the government than is, say, Western liberal thought, people like Rawls, or the liberal tradition going back to people like John Stuart Mill and Locke. So I think the support of Confucianism by people like Xi Jinping is opportunistic. That being said, I think Confucius and the Confucian tradition in general is like many other intellectual traditions, like the Christian tradition, the Jewish tradition, the Islamic tradition, the Buddhist tradition, the Hindu tradition. It's multifaceted. And again, depending on where your will is oriented, to go back to this Augustinian notion, is your will oriented towards compassion and understanding of others and achieving genuine harmony with others, then the Confucian tradition is going to mean one thing to you. If the Confucian tradition is about establishing the dominance of your in-group and coming up with a rationalization for why your in-group deserves to be dominant over others, if that's where your will is, well, then you're going to use the Confucian tradition in a very different way. For me, what's interesting about the Confucian tradition is that at its best, the Confucian tradition was about challenging people in positions of authority to actually act on behalf of the well-being of the common people. And to me, that's what the Confucian tradition is about. I also identify with the Christian tradition. And again, for me, what the Christian tradition is about at its best is Jesus saying, those who were last will be first. The meek will inherit the earth. Jesus was the guy who said, you guys don't want to talk to women, I'm going to talk to women. You don't want to talk to the tax collector, I'm going to talk to the tax collector for the Roman government. You guys don't want to hang out with the lepers and the sick because ooh, gross. I'm hanging out with the people, my brothers and sisters who need my help. For me, that's what the tradition's about. And it's not about the Pharisees who enjoy the status quo and benefit from it and like to have other people see them praying so they can impress other people with how they're praying in public, and like making money off of changing money in the temple. They figured out a little scam how to use the religion for their well-being. To me, Christianity is about challenging those status hierarchies. And I think the same thing is true of the Confucian tradition. Depending on where your will is oriented, you decide how to use the tradition.
Guys, got any comments first?
Yeah, I'm kind of relating this to like the earlier topic about not giving the ignorant a voice. It seems we're like, Confucius is assuming that there is this hierarchy and power structure. And similarly, I kind of felt, and I was curious about whether your point about not giving the ignorant access to public resources is kind of a descendant of Plato's argument about philosopher kings, right? Like that if we want people in that position of power, we want them to be wise and be educated in philosophy. And I mean, another approach would be to try to democratize these power structures so that it isn't so critical that the person in that role is wise or is benevolent towards the people. But I mean, that's just my own internal commentary on what you've been saying. But I really appreciate what you're sharing about Confucius.
Yeah.
Yeah, let me add on to that question first, because actually what Ongsu just said just dovetail with my next question, because in your book, which I'm going to quote from, you talk about how Confucius and Mengzi criticized authoritarianism and said that governments designing punitive laws are not meeting up to a virtuous standard if the motivations for compliance are for self-interest and not that people are steered by compassion, integrity, benevolence, and righteousness. And then you had this example from Mengzi about the child in the well. that when a human being sees a child in the world, and if that human being, even if he doesn't act on saving the child, but if he doesn't have a reaction of being compassionate, something's not right, and that makes for a poor virtuous person. And so, just like what Ongsu said, my question really is along the same tone. How do we determine and measure if people, in this case, we can talk about politicians, behaving to the maxims of benevolence, and they're not paying lip service to rhetoric, right? As you put it, I'm quoting from the book, as Monroe puts it, a virtuous person acts out of benevolence and righteousness. He does not merely act out benevolence and righteousness. So yeah. Santosh, you got anything to add before letting Bryan take on? Yeah, okay.
No.
Yeah, these are great questions. I mean, one way I put it with my students, and again, this is part of saying, look, I'm making my students aware, what are the presuppositions of the view that you find plausible, what are the implications of the view that you initially find plausible, and then you can think for yourself about what you want to adopt. Broadly, to oversimplify a little, there are two approaches to political philosophy, right? So there's a philosophy that starts from the assumption that humans are atomic, independent individuals. So to use a great phrase from Rousseau, who's part of this intellectual tradition, he says, man is born free and everywhere he is in chains. Man is born free and everywhere he is in chains. So do we start our political philosophy from the assumption that humans are fundamentally independent of one another, fundamentally originally don't owe anything to one another, and then we explain political organization in terms of the way that the organization benefits individuals who are fundamentally free and independent? That is the broadly liberal tradition with a small L in political philosophy. And it goes back in many ways, people like Thomas Hobbes, whom we taught it in the philosophy and political theory sequence at Yale and US, but also famously John Locke, Rousseau, and then more recently, people like John Rawls. The other approach to philosophy is, back in my day, we called it communitarian, now people call it perfectionist, but it's the idea that, as Aristotle put it, humans are by nature social animals. That is sometimes translated as man is by nature a political animal, but if you read the original Greek, man is by nature a political animal, it's more like humans are by nature social animals. What does that mean? It means, and to me, this is common sense, you're born into a society. You're born with obligations to other people. You are dependent on other people and their goodwill in order to survive as a baby and become an adult. Now, as an adult, of course, you have freedom to make certain choices, but you have to be aware that you owe things to other people for all that everybody has done to contribute to who you've become and the opportunities that you have. So these are our two fundamental political models: the lower L liberal model, where you just start from the assumption of humans as independent, not owing anything to each other, or the communitarian or perfectionist model, where you assume that we're part of a community and we start out owing things to other people. Confucians are more in the perfectionist or communitarian form. The liberal model is distinctively Western. And you see this in reactions to the pandemic. So one example I gave with my students is I said, I was at Yale and US when the pandemic started. And when I remember people were doing things like asking me, like, have you taken your temperature today? As an American, and the United States is like raised in this kind of liberal tradition, when coworkers said, have you taken your temperature today? I just felt this intense anger rise inside me. And again, I self-edited, but my gut reaction was, who are you to ask me whether I've taken my temperature today? What business is it of yours whether I took my temperature today? That's a classic American liberal way of thinking. Like, none of your damn business whether I took my temperature today. But then I calmed down. I said, that's actually an entirely reasonable question. If I've got a temperature, there's a pandemic going on, I shouldn't be coming in. And people have a right to politely inquire, well, did you actually take your temperature? You know, do you have any symptoms? And, you know, just to remind you, you shouldn't come into campus if you've got symptoms. So, and you saw this in differences between Singaporean and Chinese responses to the pandemic versus, say, American ones. While I'm in Singapore, I'm watching videos of US college students on spring break during a pandemic. And spring break in the US, it's a tradition for US college students. The stereotypical thing to do during spring break vacation is to go to Florida. So Florida is just overrun with 18 to 22-year-olds getting drunk, partying, pardon my language, hooking up sexually with, you know, people they don't know very well, and spreading disease. And so I'm watching these people on the news, and they're being interviewed like, do you think it's a good idea during a pandemic? And they're saying things like, yeah, maybe not, but I really wanted to go on spring break, you know, I was really looking forward to this. And they think that's a good answer. Whereas in both Singapore and in China, you know, people are more like, we have to work together to get this under control. And we've got to work together for the good of the community. Now, each model has its own weaknesses. The obvious weakness of the communitarian model is it can produce a lot of conformity and a lot of willingness to just accept exercises of authority against you. The strength of the liberal model is that you do have this kind of gut reaction like, no, you know, I don't have to answer your questions. No, I don't have to do what you're telling me to do. So there's strengths and weaknesses of both approaches. And for me, this is one of the things that, again, going back to when I first got interested in philosophy, it was, what do I owe the state? And if you've got a classic liberal model of political philosophy, the idea is, I only owe the state things insofar as I benefit from giving those things to the state. If you've got a classic communitarian model, the idea is, look, everything you have because other people helped you, you know, and made sacrifices for you, both earlier generations and people right now, and even people that, you know, you pay money to, you know, again, I play a lot of poker, you know, sometimes you get a dealer who's friendly and professional, and other times you get a dealer who's a jerk and isn't really trying to do a good job. They're both going to get paid. But, you know, that the dealer who actually is being friendly and doing a good job, they're doing that because they're just a good person, you know, and they're trying to be the best dealer and human being they can be, even in this little role. And I'm grateful to that. You know, and I'm going to be nice back to them. And if I can help them by wearing a mask while I'm playing poker, so I'm not a vector for disease, I'm going to do that. So I think it makes a big difference which of these political philosophies you have. And again, I tell my students, probably you're instinctively drawn to one model or the other. Be aware of what the implications are of one model of the other. So if you're like, oh, communitarianism sounds great, you should be getting vaccinated and wearing a mask. You know, or if you're like, no, I refuse to wear a mask, you know, well, then don't complain when other people don't want to cooperate with you or do things that you think they should do, right? So if you're the kind of person who says, why should I have to wear a mask? Well, why should people not be allowed to kneel during the national anthem, right? If we're all just independent individuals who can do whatever we want, you have no right to demand that other people, you know, obey, you know, social sanctions that you think are important, or that they say Merry Christmas. That's a surprisingly big issue in the United States, you know, is whether, you know, people in businesses will say Merry Christmas or just, you know, season's greetings, you know, and many people who are, again, I'm not dissing, identify as a Christian, I'm not dissing Christianity, but many people in the US who are Christians think like, oh, I'm so oppressed because the person at McDonald's won't say Merry Christmas around Christmas time. It's like, well, but not all their customers are Christians. Some are Jewish, some are Muslim, some are atheist. Why not say season's greetings?
Yeah. Angsu, you were going to say something?
No.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, yeah, actually, I was going to add that, like, through watching certain American talk show programs, they also do point out, like, why some of the East Asian countries do better when it comes to handling the pandemic is the communitarian ethic. And I think for us, like on the show, we try to strike that balance. Obviously, like personally speaking, I am quite proud with how Singapore has handled the pandemic, and I don't necessarily attribute it to just the government's policy design, but also the citizens just being quite duty conscious and adhering to social rules. But like what you said, Brian, like there is also the slippery slope of being too conformist to authority, and we need to strike that balance where on the one hand we got to respect the public good, but at the same time find also individual pockets of freedom where it counts to building a better society. I have this thing which you, because we were just, yeah.
No, I was going to say it. Correct me if I have the expression wrong, but it's sort of like the Singapore kampong spirit.
Oh, well, the funny thing is you mentioned kampong spirit, right? Which is just really to mean like trying to bring back that idyllic feeling of village cohesion.
Yeah.
Well, among some of us Singaporeans, we actually say we've lost that, because we feel quite atomized and everyone's pursuing material wealth. And it's also something that you mentioned in the book about how in China, that ethic also seems to be eroding because they've also been consumed by the hyper-individualistic ethos of capitalism and materialism. So I think Singaporeans are also battling that and hoping to revive that kampong spirit. Yeah. So actually this goes in well with something that I want you to talk about. And it's something that I really learned from your book. And I think my co-host here would benefit from you talking about this, which is the framework of different modes of hermeneutics, the theory of interpretation. So you talk about how philosophy provides the hermeneutics of faith, which is basically the idea that we can read this philosophical text in the hope of discovering truth, goodness, and beauty, and being open to the possibilities that people, even from the past or from different cultures, have something good to offer us, right? And I felt like when you also described the other modes, which is suspicion and relativism, it's kind of like a way to look at one's own philosophical temperament and proclivities, what one is, very inclined to do, to interpret things. So I thought, could you just elaborate a little bit on that? Just keep kind of a breakdown of what this means, and I think it'd be quite insightful for all of us to listen to how people interpret, what kind of moods people interpret texts and events.
Yeah, yes, this is one of the things that I talked about. I talk about it in several of my books, including there's also an appendix talking about these different hermeneutics in this book as well. And one of the reasons I got interested in it was that I found that when students were taking a philosophy course, a lot of students take to it really quickly. They may have aptitude for it or they may not, but some of them are like, oh, I get it. This is really interesting. Now you explain what's actually going on. But other students are just really puzzled, like, I don't understand what the question is you're asking or what you're doing with this text. And I came to realize that it's often in terms of this fundamental distinction in different styles of hermeneutics. And hermeneutics is just a fancy word for what's the style you use or the method you use for understanding a text. So how do you approach a text when you try to understand it? And the French philosopher Paul Ricoeur came up with this great distinction. I wish it was mine. I could die happy if I came with this distinction, but it's actually Paul Ricoeur's. He said, well, there are hermeneutics of faith or restoration, and then there's a hermeneutic of suspicion. Now, in a hermeneutic of faith or restoration, you're reading a text as a plausible candidate for truth or goodness or beauty. So you're saying maybe this text and the author behind it understand some truths about the world, or they understand something about the nature of what's good or what's right or wrong, or something about beauty that I've missed. That doesn't mean you have to agree with them, but you're taking them seriously as someone offering plausible views about truth, goodness, or beauty. The alternative is a hermeneutic of suspicion. In a hermeneutic of suspicion, you're saying, what motives for the production of this text are there that don't have anything to do with the text being true or plausible or promoting beauty in the world? And classic examples would be things like a Marxist theory is a hermeneutic of suspicion. A Nietzschean theory is a hermeneutic of suspicion. A Freudian theory is a hermeneutic of suspicion. A Foucaultian theory is a hermeneutic of suspicion. How so? Well, to give a really simple example, something like, well, yeah, let's look at an example I used before. So again, athletes in the US are often kneeling during the playing of the national anthem at the beginning of sporting events. And some people are really opposed to that. Right? Now, if I use a hermeneutic of suspicion, I'd say, okay, people say they're opposed to kneeling during the national anthem because it's disrespectful to the flag. What's the real motive for doing that? And one explanation would be, well, they don't like people protesting racial discrimination in the United States. They like the racial status quo. They like the racial hierarchy. And so they don't want anyone calling that into question. That's a hermeneutic of suspicion, because you're not accusing people of lying. You're just saying the motive for the production of these utterances, or the motive for this opposition, is something different from what's on the face of it, like maintaining power hierarchies that are to your benefit. Right? Or like a really trivial example is, suppose a little kid keeps staying, and maybe they're an adolescent, and they keep staying after class to ask their teacher questions. Well, maybe they're asking questions just because they're interested, but maybe like this cute little kid in 7th or 8th grade is, maybe they're also asking questions because they have a crush on their teacher. And so they just like spending time with their teacher because they think their teacher's real cool. That's a simple hermeneutic of suspicion. It's like, well, they don't really want to discuss the history of France that we covered in lecture in more detail, but just they like hanging out with the teacher because they got a crush on the teacher. That's a hermeneutic of suspicion. And what I say in the book is people are usually attracted instinctively to either a hermeneutic of suspicion or a hermeneutic of faith. Your gut reaction when you read a work of philosophy is either to think, okay, I don't know if I agree, but this is something I'm going to consider seriously as a candidate for truth. Or, yeah, why did this person really write it? How does writing this work benefit them in terms of their will to power? Or how does it maintain social hierarchies of power? Or how does it benefit their social class? Or how does it answer their psychological needs? Especially later in his career, Freud said the two fundamental instincts were thanatos and eros, like the erotic drive and the death drive. And so how does this work answer one of these two fundamental drives? So that's kind of the fundamental orientation. So to go back to an earlier example I gave, when Thomas Kuhn was reading Aristotle and saying, I don't get this guy's physics, it just seems so weird to me. He kept trying to figure out, why would a smart person believe this? And Kuhn didn't end up agreeing with Aristotle's physics. Of course, Kuhn thinks modern physics is correct, not Aristotelian physics. But he was trying to figure out why a smart person would have a reasonable justification for why they believe that things. That's a hermeneutic of faith or restoration. When I read Confucius, most of the time what I'm looking for is, I may agree, I may disagree, but why would an intelligent, sincere person regard this as a plausible view to have about the world? But you could also use a hermeneutic of suspicion and say things like, well, how does what Confucius says validate the role of his social class? How does it, how does it justify hierarchies that benefit him, right? So again, in contemporary China, you could say, well, is the government in China or the government in Singapore promoting Confucianism? You could say, well, how will it benefit the government if people take Confucianism seriously? How will it benefit Xi Jinping and his exercise of power if he can convince people to believe in Confucianism as opposed to being attracted to classic Western liberalism? That's a hermeneutic of suspicion. But you could also say, well, is Confucianism a plausible political philosophy? Is it a plausible ethical philosophy? When you ask those kind of questions, that's a hermeneutic of faith or restoration. Again, when you say hermeneutic of faith, it doesn't mean blind faith. It doesn't mean accepting without question. It just means you have faith that the person writing this had a perspective on the world that an intelligent person could believe in. Maybe you're going to agree, maybe you're going to disagree, but at least you're trying to see why this is a plausible account of truth, or rational justification, or a plausible exposition of beauty in the world.
I'd actually like to share my personal experience of this. In 1991, I was actually studying philosophy in Oxford, and I was part of the Oxford Philosophy Society, and they organized a trip to Czechoslovakia to study Immanuel Kant's moral philosophy with some Eastern European students. So we're all sitting in this room and discussing Immanuel Kant, and we started realizing, these two groups of people had completely different ways of reading Kant. Under the Anglo-Saxon tradition, the idea was that, you would put the philosopher's ideas under the most stress and pressure and attack it. And if it could withstand the arguments, then it's good. With the Eastern Europeans, they were like, okay, if you're saying that Immanuel Kant's saying something wrong, you haven't understood him, because we assume that he's right. And all we're disagreeing about is the interpretation. So, I mean, it's not exactly, I think both sides were actually operating under the hermeneutics of, I don't know, what did you call it?
Faith, the hermeneutic of faith.
Faith, the hermeneutics of faith. Yeah, both were. They were just approaching in different ways. But I really do like the distinction you've made. I think it's quite useful.
Yeah, but I think you're also pointing out there is this helpful way of seeing there's a variety of different ways you could do a hermeneutic of faith or restoration. And I think it's more, what I find in the US is it's more characteristic of philosophers in the so-called analytic tradition to say, we're just going to wail at, this philosopher and just criticize them really rigorously and try to find everything wrong with what they do. That's their starting point. Whereas in the continental tradition, again, this is just a hand wave. It's not always true, but it's often more the case that, well, what's something constructive we can say, starting from the assumption that this person has some kind of insight about the world, and then go from there. And I at least find with students, it's often more helpful to ask them to start with the idea that this person has something valuable to offer, especially when we're dealing with figures from different cultures or different historical periods, because their tendency, if anything, is to be too quick to dismiss. So I try to encourage a little bit of intellectual reverence, and I say, intellectual reverence is consistent with critique. You can say, like Kuhn did, look, I don't think Aristotle's right about biology. I don't think the Earth is the center of the solar system. But he's not stupid either. One video clip I sometimes use with my students is from the movie Monty Python and the Holy Grail. And I'm an older generation where everybody back in my day knew Monty Python comedy troupe and movies like Monty Python and the Holy Grail you could cite. So I'm a little dating myself here, but it is a fun movie. And at a certain point, there's an exchange. Well, I'll just tell you the beginning of the scene. The beginning of the scene is some monks chanting, holding these books in their hands. And they're chanting and they're walking with these books in their hands. And then, but like the joke is, they chant for a little bit and then they take the books and they go whack, and they hit themselves in the face with the book. And then they chant a little bit more and they go whack, and they hit themselves in the face with the book. And it's a simple joke, but it expresses, again, an entire paradigm, an entire worldview. And the worldview it expresses here is people in the Middle Ages are morons. They're idiots. They're just so stupid. And that's why people in the Middle Ages believe stuff like Aristotle, because they're just really dumb. But you think about it again, is the idea that, somehow around the year, I don't know what, 1520 or so, everybody just got like super smart, right? All of a sudden they got smart. They were stupid before, but now the water changed, or they stopped, in consuming lead or what, like all of a sudden they got smart and they understood stuff. No, there were smart people throughout history. So if they believe something different about the world, there was probably a good reason for it. So I try to encourage in my students a bit of reverence about, look, there's a reason we're reading Plato 2,400 years, after or so after he died, is because there's something deep here. And it doesn't mean he's right about everything, but it does mean that we should take him seriously. And by the way, several people have pointed out Plato. He's not a fan of democracy, as you point out, but he's also not just a mindless critic. Plato lived in ancient Athens, which was the paradigm for small d democratic government in the West for the next, more than 2,000 years. So Plato had seen democracy up close, and the reason he didn't favor democracy was he'd seen how demagogues could abuse the democratic process. And so whenever people talk about, well, maybe, I'm torn because I do believe in democracy. And I think in a way, the problem in the US right now is that we've got a political system which is insufficiently small d democratic. Because right now, the United States president is not directly elected. The United States president is elected by the Electoral College. The Electoral College votes are, for the most part, determined by whether or not you win the majority of votes in a state. And then the number of electors you get depends on a complicated formula that's combined with the number of senators you have, plus the number of representatives you had. So it's this really weird indirect process. But the effect of that is it's possible to get elected president when you lose the popular vote. So Donald Trump lost the popular vote in 2016. Hillary Clinton won the popular vote, but Trump became president in 2016 because he won the Electoral College vote. In fact, Republicans, the right-wing part of the United States, have won the popular vote in the presidential election, which is the clearest statement of the general democratic will of the American people. Republicans have won the popular vote once since Bill Clinton was first elected when I was in, high school. And so the popular vote keeps going one way, but our presidents are sometimes Republicans. And then in the US legislature, we have the House, which is has a lot of members and is closer to a democratic vote election. But then you've got the Senate. Every US state has 2 senators, regardless of its population. And so there's a lot of states in the US that are very conservative, that have very low populations. They get the same representation in the Senate as does, say, California and New York, which have huge populations, huge industrial bases, but those states get the same representation in the Senate as do states like Wyoming. And I don't have anything against Wyoming, it's a beautiful state. But I have a friend from Wyoming, and he said, there's actually more deer in Wyoming than there are people, literally. That's not like an expression, like literally there's more deer in Wyoming than there are actual people, but they get 2 senators, and California and New York, which have huge populations and are real cultural and economic centers of the United States, get 2 representatives. So in many ways, I think the problem in the US is a lack of direct democracy. But that being said, a lot of people in the US vote for people who they like the fact that they sound like them. And so Donald Trump, who's, lost a fortune gambling on real estate and was only really successful as a game show host on a show where people competed at things like selling cupcakes, got to be president of the United States. And it's pretty clear he didn't even want to really be president of the United States. He was really running as president to raise money to pay off the Russian mobsters he was in debt to. And no one expected him to win, but it turns out, that a lot of Americans are like, yeah, no, I like that guy. He's like not using all these big brainy words, and like, talking, about all this stuff I don't understand about global warming and things like that. And like, no, he talks like me. And so I'm ambivalent about direct democracy. And I think it is a problem in the United States. The United States is a very virulently anti-intellectual country. I love my country. I'm proud to be an American, all things considered, but the United States is, virulently anti-intellectual. It has been for most of its history, and demagogues can really take advantage of that. And I think that is a weakness the United States has.
So I have a kind of a question that is a bit what do you call it, off of left field, because you had you brought in your cat, and we're talking about hermeneutics of faith, and you mentioned suspicion, and actually there's the third one, which is relativism. And I wanted to ask you if you're familiar with the works of John Gray, the philosopher, who wrote Straw Dogs, and more recently the book Feline Philosophy.
Oh, no, actually I'm not, but now I'm intrigued.
Okay. So just to give, I read him just a little bit, so I don't want to say that I represent his views very accurately, but the first book that he's famous for, Straw Dogs, is based on the Tao Te Ching, right? And it's supposed to represent the expression heaven and earth are impartial, and they treat all creatures, including human beings, like straw dogs. And hence his thesis for all his works for his entire philosophical career is to say that human beings have no special intrinsic property or value as compared to other humans. And actually in the book Feline Philosophy, he admires the inner life of cats and talks about how human beings can learn a lot from looking at cat behavior and observing cat philosophy. So if you haven't read his work, then there's not much we can talk about. But I'd be curious to know what you make of a philosophy like that, where it treats human beings as being no more special on Earth, and essentially that we are all animals, and there is no special place that even human rationality has above other animal abilities or capacities.
Yeah, I guess I'm old-fashioned in this respect, in that I think that human beings do have special capacities. Now, in fairness, we learn more about other animals all the time. And so, for example, dolphins, we've learned a lot more about how intelligent dolphins are, and also we've learned a lot more about intelligence certain primates are. So it may be that dolphins and whales have some of the capacities that we think are distinctive about humans. Maybe we'll discover that chimpanzees or other higher primates do. If we do, that's okay with me. It's not important to me that humans be unique, although it was important to earlier thinkers like Aristotle and the Confucians that humans had a very unique role to play. If there are space aliens that have the same capacities we have, or some of our fellow inhabitants of this earth have some kinds of rationality or ways of thinking, if dolphins have philosophy that we just haven't learned how to decode yet, great, and welcome them to the club. That's terrific. But I would say humans seem to be, as far as we know, we do have capacities that distinguish us at least from cats and dogs. Like, I can raise the question. I just posted on Instagram a picture of my dog, and our French bulldog often sometimes he looks very happy, but a lot of times the French bulldog face just looks kind of pensive and sad. And so our dog's on the couch like this. And I posted a picture of him on Instagram saying, Diego, my dog, is contemplating Dogsein, which is a play on the Heideggerian concept, Dasein, and so, but really, I mean, my dog doesn't raise the question, what does it mean to be a dog? Or what's the point of life? I mean, yeah, I chase the ball, I chase the cat, but what's the real point of life? My dog doesn't raise that question. I think my cat has an inner life, and has desires and preferences, and even in some sense, maybe opinions about things. Like, I think she loves the dog, but also finds him annoying. I think that's a legitimate description of the inner life of my cat. My cat's like, no, he's a part of my pack, and I love him for that reason, and I like to sleep in bed with him, but also he can be real annoying, because he tries to hump me and things like that. And he chases me out of the room at dinner time. That's really annoying. I really think there's an elaborate kind of thing. But does my cat ever say, what's the point of life? Or, I wonder if everything's ultimately made out of cat parts. What's the fundamental structure of the universe? I don't believe my cat does that. And I do think it's important that humans can raise this question. So it goes back to Hannah Arendt's, essay on thinking. And I think there is something, again, if it turns out that other animals or other species do that too, great, I'm happy to treat them as equals. But I'm just saying, I think that's an important, distinct thing that we humans do. And I think it can be both our greatest strength and our greatest weakness. Like forming in groups is part of the reason humans survive, because we are social animals. And that's why I find communitarian or perfectionist political philosophies plausible. We're social animals. We need to work together to survive. Early philosophers notice this. You look at a human being and you look at like tigers and lions and wolves. Why the heck did humans survive? And why do we get to push around the other animals? And Xunzi makes this point explicitly, the Chinese Confucian Xunzi. He says, humans can control other animals because we can form groups. And we have notions like righteousness that we can use to structure the groups we're in. That's the only reason we control the other animals. So we're really fundamentally social creatures. And this ability to form these abstract concepts and act on them in a certain way is, I think, very, as far as we can tell, distinctive of human beings, at least the level at which we do it. So you also mentioned relativism. I'm kind of cranky about relativism, as I point out in the book, and why. What I find is, for students, at least in the US, I don't know if this is true in other cultures as well, but in the US, relativism only comes up when a student feels challenged by an idea and they want to hold that idea at a distance, right? So I'm just thinking, how does it function sociologically? And what it usually comes up is, when a student is kind of challenged by an idea that challenges their worldview, challenges their values, and then they're like, well, the truth is relative anyway, so who's to say, right? I've never seen relativism come up at the undergraduate level where students are trying to open up the dialogue and they're trying to let new voices in. It's more like a way of shutting things down. And one of my teachers, Lee Yearley at Stanford, he wrote an article about this. He said, there's a way in which a kind of casual relativism really supports the status quo. It goes back, and I forget whether he used this example, but supposedly when Jesus was on the way to being executed by the Roman authorities, the Roman occupation authorities in Palestine, Pontius Pilate, the local official, asked him, so who do you think you are? And he said, well, I'm the truth. And Pilate said, what's the truth? And then washed his hands. And so, but that kind of attitude is like, who's to say what the truth is? And since we don't know what the truth is, let's just continue with the status quo. Let's just execute everybody who becomes an inconvenience. Let's just silence her, because who's to say what the truth is anyway? That's not the attitude that the people who fought against Nazism in Germany, because there were Germans who fought against the Nazis and they died for it. And the White Rose Society was a group included philosophy students who spoke out against Nazism as loyal Germans, and they said this is bad for Germany, and they got executed by the secret police. They didn't say, well, who's to say what the truth is, so I'm going to die fighting against Nazism. They're like, no, Nazism is based on a bunch of lies about an international conspiracy. It's based on lies about the political opposition. It's based on lies about democracy. And I'm going to fight it even to the death if I have to. So I'm a little cranky about relativism. It's interesting because if you ask contemporary philosophers who are ethical relativists in the English-speaking world, they'll claim there are no normative consequences for relativism. They'll say, if you say the truth depends upon, there's two ways of formulating relativism. You could say truth depends on your individual perspective. That's sometimes called subjectivism. Or you could say truth depends on your culture's perspective. That's cultural relativism. I think there are problems with each view, but the contemporary relativists like Gilbert Harman is one of the most famous ethical relativists in the US, will say there are actually no normative implications for this. So relativism does not entail tolerance of other views. It doesn't entail nonviolence. It doesn't entail anything. And so you kind of wonder, well, then what's the point of the view if it doesn't actually entail anything interesting? It sounds kind of boring. But it is a favorite of, as like I say, many undergraduates. And my sense is there, when it comes up, it's more about trying to deflect challenging ideas than opening up discussions. While I'm thinking about it, I just want to recommend a book to your audience, if I may. I recently read a book by a guy named Edmonds called The Murder of Professor Schlicht. And so, and it's about the murder of a philosopher in the early 20th century by a deranged student. But it's a really interesting story because it's a very non-technical book. You can enjoy it without, you don't have to have any philosophy background, you can still enjoy it. But it talks about the development of this intellectual movement called the Vienna Circle and their philosophical position called logical positivism. And I know the Vienna Circle and logical positivism from my background in philosophy, where we study it as a very technical movement in the theory of knowledge and an attempt to give a really precise formulation of the view that all knowledge is grounded in direct experience. And I'm aware with the technical issues raised by it and the technical objections to it. But it was really fascinating reading this because I knew a little bit about this, but I learned a lot more by reading this book. The people who were involved in this technical movement in the history of philosophy and the history of science and the philosophy of science, they were very politically motivated. They thought that this intellectual system was a way of combating obscurantism, which was, they thought, the basis for the rising fascist and nationalist political movements that they were dealing with in Germany and Austria. And it really brought home to me the fact that philosophy is always political. You know, some people complain like, well, why are these philosophers getting involved in politics? Philosophy is not about politics. Philosophy's always been about politics. And you see that in the Vienna Circle, where these guys were very aware. Again, you don't have to agree with them. In some ways, I think, I mean, I see where they're coming from, because like one of the foundational debates in 20th century philosophy is an exchange between Martin Heidegger, who's a seminal philosopher in the what's called the Continental tradition, who, as I pointed out earlier, was an actual Nazi, and Rudolf Carnap, who's one of the seminal thinkers in the analytic tradition. And Carnap wrote an article critiquing an essay by Heidegger's. And the debate these guys were having was really deeply tied up in issues about politics in the era and the rise of fascism in Europe. And again, there are people like me who think you can still read and enjoy Heidegger without, despite the fact, I don't think there's an intrinsic connection between Heidegger's philosophy and fascism. But that's the kind of issue that we have to deal with and we have to debate. And so, but it just brings out the fact, again, I think it's a very readable book, The Murder of Professor Schlicht by Edmonds. And it just shows the way in which these issues about politics are always tied into issues that seemingly very abstract issues about epistemology and metaphysics and the philosophy of science. And again, it's a very readable book. You don't need to understand a lot of philosophical terminology or anything to enjoy the story.
Okay, let me just do a quick time check. How are you guys going? Ongsu and Santosh?
Good, but probably, fading. I'd also want to give Santosh an opportunity to ask a question that might be alive for him, because, the Asian philosophy is something that he's very into. So.
Yeah, so maybe Santosh, go for it, and then maybe I just have a couple of questions. Ongsu, yeah, just go for one more, and then because I've been amazed actually how long we've talked. Yeah.
Great discussion. You guys are asking great questions. Thank you so much.
Yeah, sure. Santosh, go ahead.
Yeah, no, it's been a tremendous privilege listening to you, Bryan. I was schooled in philosophy in France for 2 years, so we did a lot of philosophy, and it's quite surprising to realize that the philosophy we learned was Western philosophy, and we did not learn a single bit of Eastern philosophy. And it was only after when I returned back to Asia and I started to dig up and read up on Eastern philosophy, where I realized how deeply profound it is. Yeah, that just opened my eyes. And I'm a fan of Advaita Vedanta, which is Eastern Indian philosophy, the works of Lao Tzu, the Tao Te Ching, or even the I Ching, right? Which for me personally is deeply embodied and experiential. So it's a philosophy that has got both theory and practical, and it actually embraces a lot of the dualistic questions that we were talking about. So the first dualism that we were addressing was the dualism of, let's say, communitarianism and individualism. And then the second one was on faith and suspicion. And then the third dualism that I picked out was direct democracy and representative democracy. Yeah, and Adi Shankaracharya, who is the founder of Advaita Vedanta, 5th century genius, developed this whole theory of body of knowledge of non-dualism, whereby actually you're oscillating. Those two dualities are actually two sides of the same coin. They coexist. And there is an interdependent nature of the coexistence of these two, and that it's possible to actually be oscillating between both, and there are no absolutes in choosing one. And just in the same manner in which we cycle and we pedal a bicycle, to move forward, you need a forward momentum and a backward so that you can move forward. You need both sides of the same coin to stay balanced as you move through life. Yeah, and so that's why you need both a little bit of faith and suspicion to move through life. And that's the same analogy of a bicycle, right? If you want to be in balance or in perfect harmony with life, stay in that balance, having both. And if we look at the discourse by the Buddha in the Sutta text, it was a mix of both. And it was a true spirit of inquiry where, you know, after giving a Sutta talk, it will be open for questions, and he will deeply encourage people to question him to death, to, you know, to try to explore this deeply and not to accept things at wholesale. So this is basically like the wealth and the richness of Eastern philosophy that I've come to gain a deeper understanding of. Yeah, and I'm like going to be teaching a course on Advaita Vedanta in Germany. Not in a university, but I've been invited to. And I feel like, yeah, the next phase of my life is really going to be like just spreading the beauty and the wealth of Eastern philosophy back in the West, where I learned Western philosophy, just to show to people how rich it is. Yeah, so, you know, instead of just having a conversation on the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, which is about, you know, which is BC, before even Christ, you know, that is complemented with the asanas, the pranayamas, and then you've got your kriya practices. So those are like real deep experiential and embodied practices that reinforce the theoretical underpinnings of this philosophy, which is so beautiful because you have both theory and practice, and you can test on your body. A lot of this are actually real experiments of the self. This body of knowledge, they deal with the question of who am I? So in this whole subject-object dualism, where we study material science and natural science, which is the object, the world of objects, we actually have never considered or given due attention to the world of the subject. Who am I, and who is this subject that is experiencing this world and this reality, and what's the nature of this subject? Who am I? Yeah, so I think I was really inspired the last conversation we had when Ansu was giving a recital of the first few verses of the Tao Te Ching. That was just nourishment to the soul. You could feel it, and you could just feel so nourished by the Tao Te Ching as someone reads it. Yeah, so I mean, that's just like my personal motivation with regards to reviving ancient knowledge systems, indigenous traditions, just explaining how Ayurveda, which was the traditional Indian science of medicine, how was it developed? It was through this spiritual scientists who would call the rishis, they will be meditating and they will just go to the forest and they will just, through picking up of leaves and herbs, be able to communicate and understand the essence of what these trees and these plants were meant for, and put up a concoction of herbs that will be able to heal people. That was real deep spiritual science. And in the ancient wisdom traditions, spiritual science was actually another side of the coin to material science. Both were studied hand in hand, spiritual science and material science. They were not, there was this beautiful relationship between both, which I feel Eastern philosophy can do a lot of justice to. Yeah, so those were just like some of my own personal thoughts with regards to what you mentioned, dualism and then non-duality. Yeah, and how, you know, they are just, you can reconcile two things which are actually very difficult to reconcile in life. Yeah, so yeah, very initial thoughts, but it was a beautiful discussion.
Yeah, I think those are excellent points. And I mean, I've got a YouTube series since we were on pandemic. We were in a pandemic. I was teaching my courses remotely, and I ended up recording an entire series for my course on later Chinese philosophy, which is primarily focused on Chinese Buddhism, including Zen, but also the Huayan tradition, which is a kind of monism, but then the Neo-Confucian tradition, which developed in response to Chinese Buddhism. And I've got one of my favorite lectures in that series is on the I Ching, the classic of changes, which you were referencing. But I also talk about these issues about monism and dualism. And as you may know, there's also monistic traditions in China. In particular, there's some very powerful arguments for a monistic worldview in Huayan Buddhism, in the Chinese tradition. So to give viewers some background for whom this may just sound like a lot of jargon, I don't like to generalize about entire intellectual traditions because every intellectual tradition is multifaceted. So most generalizations you're going to make about Anglo-European philosophy or East Asian philosophy or South Asian philosophy are going to be false because there's variety in each of these traditions. That being said, one of the few things that I think might be a safe generalization about the Anglo-European tradition is that most, not all, but most thinkers in the Anglo-European tradition have thought that ultimately reality must consist of a plurality of independent things, whether those things are atoms bouncing around in the void, or they're something like Aristotelian substances, which have qualities, but each of which is independent from one another. So Aristotle gives this very compelling view of the world. He says, look, here's a book. This book has certain qualities, like having a certain weight and being certain colors and occupying a certain amount of space. Here's a pen. This pen is a separate thing. It's got its own qualities. It's got its own volume and its own weight and so on and so forth. But these are two of the many separate independent substances, to use his technical term, that exist in the world. And this becomes the dominant view in the West, that fundamentally we live in a universe of a plurality of metaphysically distinct things. But Aristotle's a smart guy. And if you read his work, The Metaphysics, particularly book Zeta in the Metaphysics, he wrestles with this issue of, well, if this book is a thing, what is the thing that is the book? And he says, well, if the thing that is the book is supposed to be the thing that has qualities like occupying a certain volume and being a certain, we'd say mass, and having certain colors, if we strip away the mass and the volume and the colors, what's left of the book? Nothing. And so he's clearly puzzled by this, and he wants to say that we live in a universe of separate independent things. But then when you try to identify those things, it seems like you strip away the qualities, there's nothing left. But still, people in the Western tradition, and again, there are exceptions like Parmenides, Spinoza, arguably Hegel, are committed to this notion that we live in a universe of a plurality of separate things. But as you point out, in the Asian traditions, there are thinkers who are willing to consider the possibility that there aren't separate independent things. In very different ways, classical Buddhism and Advaita Vedanta say, no, we don't live in a universe where there's a plurality of separate things with quality. In Advaita Vedanta, there's one thing that in some way we're all a part of, and that view is called monism. On one way of interpreting, it depends on the kind of Buddhism we're talking about, but like traditional, like Theravadan Buddhism, which you get in works like The Questions of King Milinda, which is a fascinating philosophical argument. You know, there are just transient physical and mental states that are causally related to one another, but there aren't things that are the bearers of these physical and mental states. And then in the Chinese tradition, in Huayan, you get some very sophisticated arguments that all the qualities that a thing has are relational. But if that's true, if every quality that a thing has is relational, then all that really exists is the whole that's made out of all these relational properties. So the way I explain it to my students is I say, well, look at me, what am I? If I had to describe who I am to somebody, what would I say? Well, I'm a father, I'm a husband, I'm a teacher, I'm an author, I'm a poker player. All of these are relational qualities, right? I'm a teacher because there are students. I'm a father because there are children. I'm a husband because I have a wife. I'm a poker player because there are other poker players, and there's the institution of poker, which makes it possible for me to be a poker player. So on for really every quality, even our most bare scientific qualities like mass isn't really anything except a tendency to resist acceleration. And that's a relational quality that you have. And mass also gives you a gravitational field, but a gravitational field only means something in relationship to space and time and other massive objects. And so all of our qualities seem at some level to be relational, but then there's no self independent of those relations. And then once you think that, that's going to have implications for your ethics and also for your political philosophy, right? So if I think I'm a separate, independent being, then I need an explanation for why I should care about the well-being of others. But if I realize that all I am is father, teacher, husband, so on, then my identity is intrinsically tied to the identity of other people. If I'm a bad teacher, husband, father, I'm a bad me, because there is no me beyond those relational qualities. So it has implication, it's a metaphysical view. And again, metaphysics is a big fancy word. All metaphysics means, or at least one way you can understand metaphysics is, it asks the question, what are the most fundamental kinds of things that exist, and how are those things related to one another? And I always tell my students, you are a metaphysician. You might never have heard the word before, but you're a metaphysician. Why? Because you have a view about what makes up the universe. And if you're like, oh, I don't believe in this, philosophy, metaphysics nonsense, I just believe in science. Naturalism is a metaphysical view. I find it a naive view, a mistaken view, but it is a metaphysical view, right? So you think if you're a naturalist, the only things that exist are what natural science tells us about, stuff like mass, energy, and configurations in space-time. Great, that's a metaphysical view, whether you like it or not. So you always have a metaphysical view, but the question is, do you understand the implications of your metaphysical view and the presuppositions of it? And if you think that you're fundamentally independent from other humans, then you must think you've got an identity separate from them. But what is that identity? And I think the Asian traditions are very good about problematizing this issue and saying it's really not clear how to make sense of the notion of individuals who are completely separate from other individuals. All our qualities seem to be relational. And that kind of makes sense because we are, after all, social creatures. We're primates and social animals.
Angsu, you want to ask something?
Not right now.
Okay.
But
Okay. Okay, Brian. I guess let me kind of conclude with one serious question, then one fun question. So because just now I did bring up the issue of like Chinese privilege in Singapore, and of course we acknowledge that you're not an expert on this, but as mentioned, because of this debate, hence there was this importation of talking about critical race theory and about what privilege means. So the question I have for you is, how would a Confucian, or you can maybe use some other Asian philosophical lens, look at the issue of social and wealth inequality and hierarchy. So that's a serious question. The more fun question I have for you is that in your preface to Taking Back Philosophy, you credited members of your family, for I'm quoting here, putting up with your busy schedule of naps, watching zombie movies, playing zombie games, and more naps. So I was going to say this is what's becoming of a philosophy professor. But kidding aside, can one learn any philosophy from zombie movies and games?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so that's my questions.
Well, terrific questions. I mean, again, people, like I say, there's what you make of an intellectual tradition depends, I think, on a fundamental orientation of your will in relation to the world. And again, I've criticized Kant's racism, which is evident and which is historically influential, especially through the work of his later followers, who, like I say, rewrote the history of philosophy to make all of philosophy seem like an inevitable path leading to Kant's critical idealism and going back only to ancient Greece, which was not a common view prior to the Neo-Kantians. But I think Kant was right about a lot of things. And I'll just say in passing, one of the things Kant says is, one way of understanding Kant's philosophy is he says, natural science is wonderful. It tells us so much about the way the world appears to us. But natural science won't tell you the ultimate nature of the world. It's not supposed to. Natural science is just supposed to tell you the way the world appears in terms of the categories given to us by natural science. So we can't rule out the possibility that we have immortal identities, that we'll somehow survive death. We can't rule out the possibility that we have free will beyond the world described to us by natural science. And also, Kant says, and to me, this is a knockdown argument, and this is in his groundwork of the metaphysics of morals. He says, look, we can talk all we want about determinism, but at the end of the day, you can't shake the fact that when you act, you have to think of yourself as a free being. Why? Because if I'm trying to decide, am I going to have breakfast this morning or am I just going to have coffee? I can't say, well, what am I determined to do? Let's just look around and see, what am I determined to do about breakfast? I've got to make a choice. Am I going to have breakfast or not? And that first person perspective, where I have to think of myself as a free creature, Kant says, you can theorize and give me all the natural science you want. You're not going to make that go away. So I think it's a way in which, because again, some people are like, oh, science tells us there is no free will. As an agent who views the world as an agent acting in the world, you have to think of yourself as having a choice. And then you decide, what am I going to do with the Confucian tradition, for example? How am I going to interpret it? Right? And so for me, what the Confucian tradition is about is making society work well for everybody, especially the people who are the least well off, who produce the labor that keeps society going. And I think that's what Confucianism has always been like at its heart. Confucius is not somebody who thinks you're better than somebody else just because you're rich. He certainly is not somebody who thinks that, oh, heaven is going to arrange the world so the people who are rich deserve to be rich. These, in Confucian terms, are just fantasies. Confucius said, I'll accept anybody as a student, even if all they can give me as tuition is a piece of beef jerky. That's all I'll accept, as like a kind of symbolic representation of tuition. So Confucius was born very poor, and there's reason to believe he was actually illegitimate, because his father's family when Confucius's mother died, Confucius's father's family didn't want to tell Confucius where the father was buried, because Confucius wanted to bury his mother with his father, and his family was like, no thanks. And so in a way, Confucius was born into a poor single parent household. And so, he knows what it's like to be at the bottom of the class hierarchy. And so for me, Confucianism is not about saying, oh, we have to worship rich people. And the notion of race as we know it, as I say, was invented long after Confucius. Confucius, at one point in a moment of frustration, said, I'm just going to go live among the barbarians. And one of his disciples said, oh, the barbarians are so uncouth. And Confucius said, if a gentleman lived among them, they wouldn't be uncouth. Now, that might seem very xenophobic, but the way I read it, it's like, I'm one of the barbarians, right? I'm one of the spirit of Confucius came to live among this boy from Western Pennsylvania, who's in one of the far Eastern barbarians, ironically, relative to China. And Confucius would say, yeah, but the spirit of Confucianism lives in you, so you're just as good as us Chinese who follow Confucianism. So I think that the spirit of Confucianism is really opposed to racism, and it's opposed to just, accepting the status quo, whatever it is. It's about challenging the status quo. So that would be what I'd say about that. Then, can we learn anything philosophically from zombie movies? Absolutely. And I haven't written a lot about this, but I think that one of the things that's interesting about zombie movies is you can interpret them in different ways, but I think a lot of zombie movies are implicitly politically conservative because they buy into this Hobbesian notion, this notion that goes back to Thomas Hobbes, that humans are just this far away from a war of all against all. And if a zombie apocalypse destroyed the human social structure, we'd be at a war trying to kill each other. And I find what's interesting in zombie movies is to what extent do they assume that if society decayed, we'd be at each other's throats? And to what extent do they assume that we would only survive if we could overcome that and learn to reestablish communities of mutual love and support and respect in the aftermath of the zombie apocalypse? So yeah, actually, I think there is a lot philosophically we can learn about zombie movies. I'll also give a shout out to, I've said this to some colleagues, and a colleague I recommended this game to, who's a philosopher, said, thank you so much. This was a really philosophically interesting game. Bioshock, the Bioshock series is really philosophically interesting. And this is like kind of, I won't give you any real spoilers, but there's a multiple series in the Bioshock games. The first Bioshock is a critique of radical egoism in the form of Ayn Rand's philosophy. And you end up in an undersea civilization founded on radical individualism, and the society decays because the radical individualism can't support a communitarian spirit. Then the second installment of the Bioshock series is about a cult of anti-individualism, extreme communitarianism that develops in response to this. And that's also messed up because the extreme communitarianism makes no room for individual free will or individual flourishing. And then the third series, the third installment of the Bioshock series, is about a community based on a giant airship set in the 19th century, run by a nationalistic, racist organization. And there's some really interesting twists and turns that I'm not going to give you any spoilers for in the third one, but basically it's a send up of racism, nationalistic racism. And so it's really rare that 3 installments of a series turn out well, whether it's a movie or a video game. And each of these is actually as good as like a pretty good novel. I'm not going to say these are brilliant works of art, but they're solid. They're solid philosophical works. And again, even if you're not into video games, try them out. I think you'll enjoy them. They're playable, and there's lots of twists and turns and character development in them. So I think you'll enjoy them a lot. I recommend them wholeheartedly.
Yeah, so I know the series. I didn't play it, unfortunately, but I would recommend for anyone who doesn't play video games, you can still watch it on YouTube, because nowadays you can watch the full movies being posted on YouTube. Yeah, and
Let's Play. Yeah, people do just look up a Bioshock Let's Play or playthrough for Bioshock, and you can watch somebody play it if you're totally like, I'm interested in the story, but I don't want to mash buttons. Yeah, good point. You could do that too.
yeah, so thanks so much for talking about how video games can supplement a philosophy diet. For that, yeah. Also, you got anything you want to have? Any last words, Santosh, as well, before we come to a close?
Yeah, I just want to say, I'm not sure if philosophers should govern the world, but they should definitely get more into video game designs. I think that would be great. No, this has been a lovely conversation. I think what I love about it is, just how many lines are crossed and blurred. I mean, here I am learning more about Confucius, from an American. We're talking about philosophy in video games. And yeah, I think that's what's actually very exciting about the world we live in right now. And I really love your project of supporting multicultural philosophy.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, no, I'm really excited by your work on multicultural philosophy. So thank you for bringing this to the fore in the world.
Thanks. And if people want to learn more, I'll just, shamelessly plug. I come from a family of business people, so I'll shamelessly plug my book, Taking Back Philosophy, a Multicultural Manifesto. Yeah. Again, it's a popular book. I think it turned out kind of readable. And so if you're like, oh, I never took a philosophy course, you don't need to take one to appreciate the book.
Yeah, let me just add on to that to say that, yeah, I read it over the weekend. It's very readable. And I think that we didn't quite talk about it as much through this session, but I think even if you're not someone that reads philosophy, you need to understand, like as we talk about tonight, that these ideas can have a real impact on society in terms of how it's organized, in terms of how political leaders choose to act. And it would just, help the world to, help yourself to build a better world if you just understood the kind of ideas that have generated civilization and progress. Yeah. So Bryan, thanks so much for entertaining us tonight. And we really appreciate that you've given so much of your time. And I really hope to speak to you again and obviously tweet with you on Twitter. And I hope that you come back to Singapore at some point, maybe just for a vacation, and then perhaps we can even hang out for real.
That'd be nice. Yeah. Thank you again so much. It's been great questions. I really appreciate it.
Yeah. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.